way, and I congratulate him on his recent speech. According to the House of Commons Library, there are 12 Iranian proxy forces in Bahrain, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in the Palestinian territories, and in Yemen as well. To what extent, so it's not just about the Houthis, although this is what we're dealing about now, to what extent are we able to keep tabs on and to monitor, or work with allies who can keep tabs on and monitor those dozen proxy forces that Iran is now using with increased sadly, increased repetitiveness to attack our own interests, but the interests of our allies as well?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend's absolutely right and something of an expert in this area. Iran are absolutely behind all of the different proxy groups that he outlined and many more as well, and they are, in a way, able to control this without getting themselves too involved. And the world needs to wake up and recognise that. We're, of course, monitoring all of that incredibly closely. But it is true, I think, that as with the Houthis, with all these other groups, that appeasing the Houthis, all these other groups, now will not lead to a more stable tomorrow, in the case of the Houthis with the Red Sea. And it's just being blind to the sponsors of terror that will not benefit the international order in the long run, which is why it's so important that the world has acted on this. And I will give way.
I apologise for interrupting the Defence Secretary, but the shipping side of things has seen an extraordinary reduction in confidence in that route. The only way in which confidence is going to be restored for ships to be able to pass through the Gulf of Aden and up through the Red Sea is by an increase in military convoys. I'm sure he's coming on to this, but what steps are being taken to drive up military convoys to escort vessels through that passage?
My honourable friend, as ever, raises an excellent point. That is what Operation Prosperity Guardian is all about. It is that task force which enables the shipping to be protected to an extent. He may be getting to a broader point about whether there should be individual ships protected. The view that the world has taken is that Prosperity Guardian provides an umbrella to the wider shipping. Of course, the sheer volume of ordinary traffic through the Red Sea means that you need that international task force, in this case US-led, for the security of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And this is incredibly important. I mean, after all, we are part of defending the international rules-based order in the actions that we're taking. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, last week I was actually on board HMS Diamond, who are right at the heart of this issue in the Red Sea, talking to our brave sailors who are out there protecting our critical sea lanes. The House will know that this is the first Royal Navy ship's company for 32 years who fired in anger or in self-defence in their case. And it was fascinating talking to them about their experience, but also witnessing their professionalism in the way that they have dealt with this challenge. It really did not have to be this way, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We've worked hard to warn the Houthis off. At the start of the year, the world sent a very clear message to the Houthis: end your illegal and unjustified actions. Stop risking innocent lives. Please stop illegally detaining vessels and crews. Cease threatening the global economy. But all of these warnings, all of them, fell on deaf ears, and eventually enough was enough.
Will the
so, I'll give way.
I'm grateful. I completely support the government's action, which is totally in accordance with international law and defending freedom of navigation on the high seas. But we can only do it with people. Otherwise, there's no one to maintain the typhoons or to crew the warships. We now have people leaving 3 times as fast as we're recruiting them, as the Secretary of State is aware. Can you give a commitment now? He'll come to the House before Easter to make a statement about what we're doing about retention of critical armed forces personnel. He knows why this is important.
Well, my honourable friend's been very, very solid on these issues, and he and I have spoken about it through the Select Committee and elsewhere, and he'll be pleased to know that I've recently been holding meetings with individuals who he believes himself will help to resolve this issue, and I am working very hard to make sure that, in common with actually many Western militaries, armed forces, that we do have the men and women that we need for our armed forces, skilled up to the right levels and capable of taking on this challenge. He'll be reassured to know that I also went to Akrotiri last week and met the Typhoon pilots, again, incredibly highly skilled, but backed with an enormous array of tanker pilots, ground crew, mechanics, and many others besides. It's very, very important that we support them. I'm working very hard on this, and I will come back to him and the Select Committee, and indeed the House, with future plans to back up what Haythorne, Waite and others have already proposed. A fortnight ago, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister, relevant Cabinet Ministers and I authorised the RAF precision strikes using 4 Typhoon FGR-4s and supported by 2 Voyager air refuelling tankers. They struck facilities at Bani in the northwestern of Yemen and an airfield at Nablus. The sites being used to launch reconnaissance and attack drones as well as cruise missiles over the Red Sea, and they were destroyed. And let me reiterate what has been said before. This was limited, necessary, proportionate. It was taken and done in self-defence and in response to very specific threats and in line with international law. I will give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for his contribution and for all he has been doing over the last few weeks. As he makes clear, this has been an increasingly difficult situation. We had no choice but to act. But can I ask, what is our assessment of the extent to which we need to degrade Houthi capabilities for them to change their intent and for them to change their actions? Because as yet, I'm unclear as to whether we have that ability to look into what the Houthis are thinking, let alone Iran's activities. And we must also recognise, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Houthis are at best a disobedient ally and not really a proxy, so they do have their own interests that they are pursuing.
Well, my honourable friend, with her immense experience from Foreign Affairs Select Committee Chair perspective, is absolutely right about the formation of the Houthis, who, if you look back in their history, are actually opportunists. Only as far back as 2015, they didn't support Hamas. Now they claim that their entire programme is in support of Hamas's illegal activities. She also asked, quite rightly, the question of what proportion of the Houthi equipment and machinery has been destroyed. We work with others to assess the sort of battle damage, as it were. I can confirm that the attacks so far have been complete in their targets, but their modus operandi is flexibility, and they will use launching sites as they see fit, which is why our US allies have been using what they would describe as dynamic strikes as they ping up. And sadly, as my honourable friend in the House will know, that the Houthis continued to persist, even though they've been dealt a blow, and a further 12 attacks followed, including anti-ship ballistic missiles, an unmanned aerial system, which struck 2 US-owned merchant vessels. Our intelligence has continued to highlight an ongoing and imminent threat to our commercial and military vessels across the region. As the Prime Minister told the House just yesterday, attempting to respond to the Houthis after they launched their irrational assaults is simply not a sustainable way to proceed. So on Monday night, working alongside our US partners, but also with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada and the Netherlands, the Prime Minister and I authorised a second wave of strikes. These are once again deployed using precision-guided pave-way 4 missiles. They destroyed 8 targets near Sana'a airfield, taking out clusters of Mirage surface-to-air missile launchers and further degrading the Houthis' ability to hold our seas to ransom. Our targeting, once again, is very carefully planned and very precise. We're not aware that there were any civilian casualties at all, and the operation was designed in that context. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this was actually a complex joint operation involving close cooperation between the UK and the US air crews. I wish to pay tribute to our brave pilots and our air crews who carried out this action so very effectively. Last week, as I mentioned, it was a real honour to meet those pilots and the support team in Akrotiri, and each of them professional to the last. But the military track is only one part of a much more comprehensive government response. And as the Prime Minister set out in his statement yesterday, we're working diplomatically to reduce the regional tensions, making it clear, especially to the Iranians, that they must stop supplying weapons and intelligence and training and money to the Houthis. We're working with our allies to halt the illegal flow of arms to the Houthi militia. We're working and seeking to cut off the Houthis' financial support. And we're determined to help the people of Yemen, who the Houthis are not friends of, to ensure that they receive the humanitarian aid that they need. And despite the Houthis' absurd claims to be the sort of Robin Hood of Yemen, the reality is they're simply exploiting the turmoil in the Middle East to their own advantage and in their own self-interest, a point that was made to me very strongly when I spoke to the president of Yemen recently. Ordinary Yemenis have not benefited, not one iota, from their malign activity. On the contrary, they're actually the victims of the same Houthi thuggery as anyone else. It hits our and the world's global trade, and it will only in the end also hurt the Yemeni population, damaging their security, driving up food prices. But the Houthis should be in no doubt at all that the world needs them to cease and desist their illegal behaviour. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, today, as I said at the top, we're living in what feels like a more dangerous world. But the UK will not be cowed. We will not retreat to our shores. Instead, we will continue to lead. We're already, as the whole House knows, leading in Ukraine, and we've increased our military support to £2.5 billion and signed a historic agreement on security cooperation, laying the foundation for a century-long partnership with our Ukrainian friends. We're also leading in NATO too, where we've sent some 20,000 personnel to participate in exercise Steadfast Defender. To put that into context, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are 32 countries involved in this operation, and we're providing half of this NATO exercises personnel. We're also, though, on today's subject, leading in the Red Sea. This great waterway is one of mankind's earliest trade routes. In fact, it was active since the days of Pharaoh, active through the Roman times, and we will do all we can to keep it active in the 21st century as well. We're working with our allies to deter regional danger, keeping these vital sea lanes open so our ships and many others can traverse the ancient waters without fear. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the situation in the Red Sea. John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The House was set today to debate the full sweep of defence and international affairs until yesterday's change to business, which gave this debate the focus on the Red Sea. Whilst I know that members on all sides will welcome the opportunity to debate and question the government on the UK's presence and on the tensions in this part of the Middle East, and I look forward to the contributions from all sides to this debate. Nevertheless, I hope ministers will ensure that we also get the opportunity soon to debate the broader aspects of defence, especially on Ukraine, as the Defence Secretary has sort of indicated tonight in his remarks he's also keen to do. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will give way, of course.
I've said for a very long time, in the old days we used to have set government debates on government time on defence, as we are doing this afternoon. We haven't so far in recent times at all. It's been down to the Backbench Business Committee, which I very much welcome, the BBBC, it's a great organisation. But nonetheless, we ought to have defence debates in government time on a Wednesday or a Tuesday, set by the government, and I hope very much the Secretary of State will make sure that happens in the future.
Well, the honourable gentleman has a great experience in this. He's right to say government time signals the importance that government gives to the business that it brings to this House. So whilst the Backbench Business Committee does an important and useful job, it's government time that matters. And since the Defence Secretary has been in post, we have not had that general debate on defence, and we should. And we have not had a debate on Ukraine for 4 months, and we should, certainly ahead of the 2-year mark next month, when we see the anniversary, the bloody anniversary of Putin's illegal invasion in Ukraine. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm most grateful. We've also not had a debate since the 7th of October on Israel and Palestine, which is perhaps quite extraordinary. In fact, there's an irony that had we gone ahead with the original debate today on international relations, that could have been subject for debate, and that is now restricted by this debate. It's clear why this is a priority. That probably is a priority as well, which the government might wish to take up, which I raised previously with the Leader of the House.
Well, at the risk of sounding a bit like the shadow leader of the House, responding to a sort of business question, my honourable friend is right. He's also very experienced, and I'm sure he will find a way, just as the Prime Minister did yesterday on his statement about the Red Sea action, to talk more widely about Israel and Palestine. I'm sure my honourable friend may find a way of doing that without testing the Deputy Speaker's patience too far this afternoon. I'll give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Member. Can I thank him for the remarks he's just made about Ukraine? And I think it is important, in the context of everything which is happening globally, that we take the opportunity once again to say that we stand up with Ukraine, particularly in the light of the changing political landscape in North America, and the responsibility that there is on all of us here and our allies in Europe, that we must send out the message that we will do everything that is needed to support that country, and that they must prevail against the aggression from Putin.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I for one appreciate the leadership that he gave to his party when Putin invaded Ukraine. And he, like us, has demonstrated that UK has been and remains totally united behind Ukraine and in confronting Russian aggression. And just say to the Defence Secretary, one of the important things that the government does by organising a debate in this House on Ukraine is to signal the importance that we can all, on all sides, give to that support to Ukraine. And also it's a chance to explain to the British public why this matters so much, why defence of the UK starts in Ukraine, and it is essential to our interests that Ukraine and not Putin prevails. I'll give way.
One way in which one can stretch the terms of this debate a little further than its precise wording without nevertheless infringing any rules is to remark upon the fact that in the Red Sea, British naval assets are particularly important. And does the Shadow Secretary of State agree with me that there should be no question now or in the near or medium future that we should lose the assets of our amphibious assault ships, which are so necessary for the sort of combined operations that one has to engage in when taking on piratical opponents?
Yeah, quite right.
Perfectly done was that.
Well, one of the other ways of stretching the limits of a tightly drawn debate, of course, is experienced interventions of the nature that the Right Honourable Gentleman has just demonstrated. And one of the advantages of a debate like this, of course, is that we don't just hear from the government at the start of the debate, we hear from the government at the end of the debate. So the very specific question that he poses is one that we can look forward to the government minister picking up and responding to when he winds up. Mr. What do I think? Well, it would be helpful to have access to the sort of classified information that the Defence Secretary has in order to make these decisions. It's his responsibility to do so, and it's our responsibility in this House to challenge him and hold him to account when he makes those decisions, and of course if he fails to make decisions as well. Mr Deputy Speaker, perhaps I might return to the Red Sea and the theme and focus for this debate. We now have around 2,500 military personnel in the Middle East, and I want to begin by recognising their special service. Many were deployed at short notice. Most were away from their families over Christmas, helping supply essential aid for the Palestinians in Gaza, working to reinforce regional security and reduce the risk of wider escalation, operating under great pressure and threat in cases like the crew of HMS Diamond and the pilots on the Typhoons and air tankers. They undertake their tasks with total professionalism. We thank them. We are proud of them. I give way.
I'm most grateful. I just think it's worthwhile at this juncture making the point, which I know the Secretary of State will want to, I'm sure, refer to, that actually the Iranian proxies are very regularly rocketing or attempting to rocket US bases in Iraq. And some of those bases, there is a UK presence as well. And it is only through good luck that there hasn't been, and actually very complex air defence, if I understand correctly, that there have not been very considerable US casualties, but also the potential to UK casualties. And I think that is a point that we need to bear in mind when we talk not only about Iranian proxies, but we also talk about UK forces in the Middle East. Thank you.
The Honourable Gentleman has insights which are rare even in this House into the situation from his own experience and his particular interests. He's totally right. It isn't just the risks of Iranian-backed proxies in Iraq. This is one of the flashpoints and the risks of wider escalation. The Iranian interests in Iraq and the attacks on the American bases and personnel, some of which he says quite rightly we share with UK personnel. Mercifully, none have led to any deaths. It has led to some injuries, and it's a worry that it would be good, I think, to hear from the Defence Secretary, given that we have 2,500 UK personnel in the region, what are the additional protections and measures he's ensuring are put in place given the heightened risk that they may face. Mr Deputy Speaker, our UK military presence in the Red Sea itself is there to protect international shipping and strengthen regional security. And if anyone doubts this case, then consider what the consequences of no action taken to deal with the Houthi attacks. This extremist force, backed by Iran, with a long record of brutal piracy in the region, could attack commercial ships at will and attack our own Navy ships without consequence. They are targeting the ships of all nations, threatening the freedom of global trade, putting civilian and military lives in serious danger. That's why 20 countries joined the Red Sea Maritime Protection Force, Operation Prosperity Guardian, last month, why the UN Security Council this month itself passed the resolution condemning the Houthi actions and demanding their attacks stop. And it is why the UK and US, with operational support from 4 other nations, have conducted joint strikes on Houthi missile sites, command centres and weapons stores. We back the 2 UK-US joint airstrikes carried out this month. We accept these were targeted, necessary and devised to minimise the risk of civilian life, and we'll judge any future UK military action on its merits. The ministers have said the aim of these strikes is first to degrade Houthi capabilities and second to deter their attacks. We accept the attacks were justified, but we ask the Defence Secretary to confirm how they were also effective. We know deterrence is a sliding scale, so we ask the Defence Secretary how the government will guard against Britain being sucked deeper into the Yemeni conflict. We also back the leading role the Royal Navy has in the continuing military defence of shipping from all nations against further Houthi missiles, drones and attack boats. However, the lion's share of this responsibility for protecting international freedom of navigation in the Red Sea is being shouldered by the Americans, just as the US has been doing across the world for nearly 80 years. So what action is the government taking to persuade other countries to join the Maritime Protection Force? What is it doing to persuade those already involved to deploy more ships? And what efforts is the government making to encourage other nations with a big global trade interest to play a part in protecting freedom of navigation and using their influence to stop the Houthi attacks? And how long does he expect Operation Prosperity Guardian to be needed? Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the US aircraft carrier, USS Eisenhower, has been essential to the operations to date in the Red Sea. Is the UK carrier ready to deploy to the Red Sea, if required? Has the Defence Secretary made the decision not to deploy HMS Queen Elizabeth? And if not, why not? Now, our UK destroyer HMS Diamond, which the Defence Secretary has paid tribute to, has also played a hugely important and impressive part in the Maritime Task Force. She's been there for nearly 2 months. She will need to be rotated out. Do we have a second UK destroyer available to replace HMS Diamond in the Red Sea? And if not, what will replace her? If this is to be HMS Richmond, when will she arrive in the Red Sea? And how will this change the capabilities that we can contribute to Prosperity Guardian? Finally, we must cut the illegal flow of arms to the Houthi militia. The US intercepted a weapons shipment around 2 weeks ago, and the UK has successfully done similarly in the past. What is the UK's capability and plan for doing so again now? Mr. Deputy Speaker, rather as the Defence Secretary indicated, military action on its own can't solve the problems in this region. So what is the government's diplomatic action to pressure the Houthis to cease their attacks and settle the civil war in Yemen, and to pressure Iran to stop supplying weapons and intelligence to the Houthis? Mr. Deputy Speaker, like the Defence Secretary today and the leader of the opposition yesterday, I totally reject the Houthi claims that firing missiles and drones at ships from around the world is somehow linked to the conflict in Gaza. They've been attacking oil tankers and seizing ships for at least 5 years, not just the last 109 days since the 7th of October. These attacks do absolutely nothing for the Palestinian people. We want the Gaza fighting to stop, with a humanitarian truce now, then a sustainable ceasefire to stop the killing of innocent citizens, to get all remaining hostages out and get much more aid in to Gaza. This is what we've been calling for in public. It's been what we've been working for in private. Our leader, our Shadow Foreign Secretary, our International Development Minister have all been out in the region in the last 3 months. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the humanitarian agonies of the Palestinians in Gaza are now extreme. Parents are starving, children drinking dirty water, even reports of amputations being carried out without anaesthetic. More aid has to get to Palestinians now. And surely Britain can do more. There have been just 4 RAF aid flights and 1 Navy shipment in nearly 4 months. We got 100 tons of aid to Turkey in the first 10 days after the earthquake last year. And in parliamentary questions, the Armed Forces Minister has told me recently the RAF and the Navy stand by, ready to do more, but the FCDO haven't asked them. What is going on? There should be a steady stream of aid coming from Britain. Our aid efforts have to be accelerated. And for long-term peace, there has to be a political process, one that has the capacity, the conviction, the commitment to turn the rhetoric around 2 states living side by side in peace into reality. And many across this House, like all in my Labour Party here, will have found the Israeli Prime Minister's recent rejection of the 2-state settlement utterly unacceptable and wrong. Palestinian statehood is the inalienable right of the Palestinian people, the only long-term hope for peace and stability, for normalisation for both Israelis and Palestinians. If we're elected to government, Labour will lead a new push for peace, working with international allies and confident, as the Prime Minister said yesterday to this House, that we in this country, we in this House, are united in support of a two-state solution.
Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Whilst much of the debate today will rightly focus on the rationale, the execution and the objectives of the recent airstrikes against Houthi rebel military infrastructure, I want to begin with some comments on who the Houthis really are, because I have been deeply disturbed by the comments that have been made in our national conversation, somehow painting them as a progressive movement, freedom fighters, or some kind of legitimate representative body for the Yemeni people. This is so disturbing because not only are people not taking the time to educate themselves, but the Houthis don't deny who they are. It is out there for all to see. Their rallying cry and flag is quite explicit. Death to America, death to Israel, a curse upon the Jews. This is the words that this group puts on their flag. This is their rallying cry, and every action the Houthis take is with this in mind, with hatred in their hearts. And yet we see people, often well-meaning people, and I have to say sometimes concerning, I have even seen people within this House make suggestions otherwise, that Yemen has freedom fighters on its shores, and that somehow because Yemen, they claim, was a British colony, the Houthis should be seen as anti-colonial freedom fighters. But unlike southern Yemen, North Yemen was never a British colony. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, North Yemen was ruled by the Imamate, a theocratic polity led by the religious leader of the Zaidi Shia. The Houthis offer no vision for Yemen's future. They seek a return to the past, free from ideals such as equality, women's rights and democracy. What inspiration they do draw from the modern world comes from the Ayatollah and the Islamic Revolutionary Movement of Iran. We can trace their violent rise to what was initially a moment of hope for Yemen. We all remember the Arab Spring back in 2011, when Yemenis together they rose up and they toppled the dictatorship. But employing the Ayatollah's handbook, the Houthis initially pledged themselves to cooperation in building a new Yemen, sending delegates to the national dialogue, building a deliberate facade where they were working actually to reject the future that young Yemenis dreamt of. Armed by Iran, the Houthis blocked the 2014 referendum on the introduction of a new democratic constitution, and they began a military campaign of conquest and repression. Now, whilst it is easy for us to judge from afar and pass judgments, the people of Yemen are the witnesses of their crimes. I want to share briefly with the House the story of Barar Shiban, a Yemeni democracy and human rights activist who sat on the Yemeni National Dialogue and saw firsthand how the Houthis used deception and oppression to secure their power base. Barar has since claimed refuge in the UK and now works on the cause of Yemen as a fellow at RUSI. He shares with me that after the Houthi coup in 2014, they banned all political parties. They closed all media outlets, and they suppressed Yemen's fledgling civil society that was just beginning to bud. They rejected all calls for elections and instead chose to govern through fear and intimidation. Barar was an eyewitness to the Houthi method of conquest from 2014. He saw 2 small rural villages refuse to surrender to the so-called rebels. In response, they forced all of the residents to watch as they summarily blew up all the houses in front of them. He observed as they kidnapped and murdered the family of Akram al-Zurqa, a community leader in his province, before filming themselves blowing up those families for vile propaganda purposes. The brutality of the Houthi leadership has been recognised by our government, and UN security resolutions have been put in place against leader Sultan Zabin for the rape and torture of politically active women. Let that sink in, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Women who choose to have a voice in Yemen will be tortured. The head of the Houthi security services arbitrarily detained them and raped them for speaking their minds. Not merely content with brutalising villages and women, the Houthis detained 2 of Barar's friends from the Arab Spring protests, young journalists Abdullah and Yusuf. They locked them into a weapons depot, knowing full well that it would be bombed by the Saudi-led coalition to oppose the Houthis, and they left them there to die. There was a clear breach of international law, as was their industrialised taking of children and forcing them to be soldiers. The UN estimates that 2,000 children have been killed after being forced to be soldiers for the Houthis just in 1 year, between 2020 and 2021. Tragically, the Houthis also expelled Yemen's 3,500-year-old Jewish community from their homeland and banished the last Jewish family back in March 2021. Yet now they say that they're acting in defence of Gaza. Now they say they've always cared about the Palestinian cause, despite having hated Israel, yes, but done nothing in the interest of the people of Palestine. This conflict is merely an attempt to distract from their own brutal regime at home and gain clout. Because let's be clear, within terrorists, there is a pecking order, and they are fighting for who's the big man on the block. And the Houthis, they think this is their chance. I would very happily give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend. She's making some very important points about education. And I think it's just worth mentioning, my honourable friend agrees, that one of the other things the Houthis did was deliberately block humanitarian aid coming into the ports, to deliberately starve the population. So when they're making the parallel to the terrible situation in Gaza, their actions show that they don't believe in that at all.
It's no surprise that my right honourable friend makes a very important point, whether it's blocking aid, whether it's forcing children to act as soldiers, whether it's raping and torturing women. The Houthis have no interest in supporting anyone but their own power, and they have consistently lied to the people of Yemen, and we cannot allow them to act again. So I would urge anyone in this country who is suggesting in any way that the Houthis are acting in the interest of the Palestinians, please take the time, and if you won't, at least look in the mirror. Before moving on quickly, I want to look at the reasons why we're absolutely right to take this action. These strikes were a strategic necessity. Article 51 of the UN Charter, the legal right to self-defence to ensure maritime freedom, is absolute. The days leading up to these airstrikes, we saw the UN Council come together and they agreed that action was needed. There was a motion calling for an immediate end to Houthi attacks on shipping. Leading up to these attacks, there were 26 attacks in those waters. Now, that may have been not much reported in the media here, but it was elsewhere. Our Royal Navy have had to defend themselves against the worst attack against our ships for decades, and the US are having to deploy Tomahawk missiles to protect themselves. That's almost unheard of for a very long period of time. Now, we all heard the arguments from the Defence Secretary, who we all know full well that almost 30% of all shipping containers pass through that area of water, and 90% of all ships are having to avoid it. So I want to look at the Houthi military capabilities briefly, because I think, particularly with some young people, there seems to be a view, thanks to a very unhelpful TikTok account, and you all know my views on TikTok, and it's unsurprisingly that TikTok is helping spread unhelpful narratives. There seems to be a young man bobbing around on the waters outside Yemen, looking rather, he could be a star of a movie, I'll admit, but bobbing around suggesting that they're working here in the interest of Palestinians. The Houthis are incredibly well armed, beyond that which many think. They have the Iranian support, yes, and the Iranians have provided rockets and drones, but they also have their own domestic capabilities. Because we have to remember that the former dictator of Yemen defected to their cause. And what did he do? He brought with him ballistic and cruise missiles. Where have they now been used? Against the Royal Navy, against the US, against allies. One F-5 jet. Some may say it's only one jet. It is a jet that is attacking the Royal Navy, and we have seen them out using these against us. They have helicopter pilots. They have so much more domestic capacity beyond that which they are being given by the Iranians. And so therefore it is important, and I would ask the Defence Secretary at some point to update the House on what assessment we have of not just how we strangle Iranian donations of equipment to the Houthis, but also what assessment you have of how much more equipment they have hidden. Because we know they've buried it under the ground, but we also know they took a great deal when they took control. And yes, we do need to tackle on how we strangle the equipment coming to them from Iran. Going to strategic concerns, I've already asked the Defence Secretary how we make sure that we have an assessment as the point at which we need to degrade Houthi capabilities so that they change their intent. This is a deterrence mission. The reason we are doing this is to put in place deterrence. So how far down the process of attrition are we? How do we ensure we don't become the Air Force of the Yemeni government? And how do we make sure that we have a point at which we are operating to, not just having to keep trying until we see them change direction? I'm also concerned because Yemen is still in a state of civil war. And whilst the Houthis control the majority of the population, they only control about 40% of the territory. Meanwhile, we have Al-Qaeda, Arabian Peninsula, and Daesh both operating in Yemen. Now, my understanding is that there may be some sort of informal relationship between AQAP and the Houthis, because AQ have been able to move equipment and material across the country to where they have their bases. However, terrorists, as we say, as I touched on earlier, have a pecking order. They like to be the big man on the street. I'm concerned that we are going to see these two groups now step up their operations and capitalise on what they see as a competing terrorist group being under attack. So how do we make sure that we are acting now to make sure that other terrorist groups are not capitalising on those attacks? The member for the Isle of Wight rightly raised his concerns about Iraq. This was the first question I asked the Foreign Secretary when he rang me to talk to me about these airstrikes. I am deeply concerned about our footprint within Iraq, not least because we have seen over the last few months increasing attack by Shia militias in the behoved to the Iranian regime attacking our assets, and we have a significant footprint there. We've also now seen the IRGC commit an airstrike in Erbil, and that is both concerning but also an opportunity. For the IRGC to have taken responsibility for an airstrike like that is a step change. We have not seen them do that in the past. So that A, gives more credence to what I'm sure we will hear from the Honourable Right Honourable Member from Somerset, that we need to prescribe the IRGC, but also changes fundamentally the way in which we can talk about the IRGC and its operations. So what is the government's assessment of how the Red Sea situation is likely to escalate, particularly within Iraq, and how are we working to protect our assets? I would also briefly touch on Syria. Many colleagues will know that the decision not to intervene militarily in Syria when the vote came to Parliament, for me, was one of the driving reasons that I joined this place. And I still believe that it was a great mistake that was made that day. Syria has now become, and forgive me if I sound flippant, but Syria has become the Amazon warehouse for terrorists, whether it be narcotics, weapons, people, Shia militias, trafficking, you name it, it is all taking place in Syria. So what are we doing to reduce the risks emanating from Syria to our assets and our interests on the ground? Touching then on Iranian proxies, the Houthis are only one of Iran's proxies and allies, and as I touched on earlier, different proxies have different relationships, and I believe the Houthis to be more of a disobedient ally rather than a direct proxy, because the command and control is not as significant as it is, for example, with Hezbollah. So we have Hamas, we have Hezbollah, we have Iraqi Shia militias, and we have the Assad regime in Syria. What work are we doing to make sure that we have a clear intent and assessment as the differing relationships between different proxies and allies with Iran? Because some will be receiving just intelligence, some will be receiving material, some there will be direct command and control, some will feel greater loyalty to others. Because what we need to assess is the extent to which Iran will conduct further conflict and chaos to defend each of these proxies. I suspect, for example, that Hezbollah is far more happy to wage full-on warfare in defence of the clerics in Iran than perhaps other Houthis would be. So how do we make sure we get there? I would also caution that I have severe concerns about Hezbollah's future actions. Nasrallah has so far decided to stay out of the action, but the reality is that could change in a moment. Again, this goes back to who wants to be seen as the best terrorist on the block. And Nasrallah is deeply ideologically tied to the Ayatollahs, more so than any others. And obviously, whilst in the past Hezbollah has acted as almost a tripwire to protect Iran's nuclear capabilities, now they have been acting, unfortunately, what we may not see as significant restraint. Hezbollah has been showing significant restraint given their capabilities. And so I'm concerned that we may see them go forward.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. I think in a sense what she's outlining is the scale of the challenge and the threats that we face, not just throughout parts of the Middle East, but in Africa and, of course, as we know, in Europe as well. And does it not bring home the responsibility that we have to make sure that we've got a strategic assessment of how we react to all of those, not just for those of us on these islands, but with our partners as well, because today the threats that we face are perhaps greater than at any time since the Second World War.
I thank my honourable friend, who is always generous in his thoughts and his considerations, contributions to debate like this. I agree entirely. And it takes me to my fundamental point, which is this may be called a debate on the Red Sea, but really we are talking about Iran. When it comes to Iran, my assessment, and colleagues may differ, is that Iran is willing to do everything but reach outright warfare. They will industrialise sub-threshold conflict and they will seek chaos wherever they are. But my worry is that their current appetite, where they have set their threshold as being just below outright warfare, is too high. And I think the message that needs to go out from our allies to the Iranians, and I was very pleased to see the Foreign Secretary meeting with the Iranians to deliver this message himself, but we need to hear it from Arab partners, is that your threshold is too high, Iran. You must pull back. That needs to be our strategic priority, and I hope that the government will be bringing people together. I myself am looking at perhaps drawing together a half-day workshop for any MP in the House to come together to look at how we together believe the policy solutions might be to tackle Iran, because all roads lead to Iran. And my worry when it comes to Iran is that we are compartmentalising our response to them. They have nuclear ambitions, they have proxies, they have given Russia the drones that they need, and I believe the relationship between Iran and Russia has now become a strategic one, and it has fully reversed from what we saw over the last 2 decades. We are seeing hostage-taking, assassinations, transnational repression, and femicide at home. We have to stop treating those individual issues as if they can somehow be drawn away from each other, and recognise we need a strategic approach working with our allies to do all of them. Because at the moment, we see individual escalations in each of those areas, and we don't respond comprehensively. So we see Iran massively increase their drone production and giving them all to Russia, but we don't see a significant response. We see Iran taking more and more hostages, but we don't see a significant response. Because in isolation, all these things look like a small gradual ratcheting, but when you put them together, the situation is utterly untenable. I will hesitate to talk too much about IRGC prescription because I feel like I may steal other colleagues' sandwiches, so I will leave that with them. But I think the record is well known on this House as to the position, and I will acknowledge it is not a straightforward decision. Yes, Iran will see this as an act of war. Yes, we will likely have to close our embassy on the ground. However, we need to take action against the IRGC. Only this week we saw a BBC video where generals of the IRGC who were sanctioned were holding recruitment Zooms with British national students' organisations. This is the same organisation that MI5 had to go out and warn was conducting assassinations on our soil. And while I'm here, I will also repeat my call for the creation of a special envoy or a special Prime Minister lead for those who are arbitrarily detained, because we do need someone who can focus on this throughout the peace. I briefly want to touch on Iran at home, because I do believe we are dealing with the most brittle Iran that we have for a long time. The way Iran rules is essentially a protection racket, and people have started to see through that. They are splintering, but I think it's too early to see the actors for change who will actually escalate the situation. Looking then briefly to the diplomatic effort, there has been too much of a focus on the E3 plus the US. We need an Arab-led solution. We need to bring our Arab partners into the fold far more on this. There is an anxiety that the West is not a long-term strategic partner and that we will conduct this isolated activity that is absolutely right, but then not stay and be committed long-term. So how do we demonstrate commitment to build a broader coalition that can meaningfully push back against Iranian influence in the region to protect us not just there, but also at home? That leads me then to the threat to the UK from Iran, and I am gravely concerned that we are not yet taking this seriously enough. Yes, we have now seen the Islamic Centre closed under a review from the Charity Commission. Yes, I managed to get their education centre in the west of London to no longer be accredited, but we are not doing enough to tackle transnational repression in the UK. Mr Deputy Speaker, these strikes are both legal and proportionate and a response to hugely damaging attacks by Houthi rebels on the rule of law and global commerce. A failure to act would result in global economic hardship, huge damage to the British economy, a resurgence in inflation, and the risk of a successful Houthi attack on a Royal Navy or British maritime vessel. This is about re-establishing deterrence, but it is also about sending a message to Taiwan and to the PRC. If we think what we have seen over the last few weeks is concerning in terms of global trade, this is absolutely nothing compared to what we would see. I would reiterate that these attacks have absolutely nothing to do with Gaza. We must reject this false narrative, which is designed solely to further the Houthis along their blood-soaked road to power in Yemen and the Ayatollah's dreams of regional domination. What unites the Houthis and the Iranian regime is their willingness to sacrifice innocent people in their pursuit of power and their readiness to inflict unthinkable violence on anyone who opposes them. Now I would ask the government to avoid the mistakes of the past and to think long-term and strategically about how we go from here. We all want to see a two-state solution and a Palestinian state, but what we need now is an international Palestine contact group and to launch track 2 negotiations bringing together civil society, women and academics. I would also urge all colleagues, those of us who would quickly condemn anyone who denied the right to Israeli statehood must also condemn those who deny the right to the Palestinians for their own state. A true friend seeks to end the cycles of war and not add more fuel to the fire. Iran and the Houthis are no friends of the Palestinian people. I asked Barra Shiban, the Yemeni democracy activist, to summarise what the Houthis have done to his country, and this is what he said. The Houthis run a network of militias that terrorise the Yemeni people for more than a decade, and their atrocities were ignored by the international community. The Houthis film themselves blowing up our houses, and those of their opponents and their top leaders have been sanctioned by the UK rightly for using sexual violence against women activists. Now the House of Commons should call for holding them accountable and recognise the plight of the Yemeni people. I hope that we will not have to see many more strikes in the region, but I suspect this is not the end of them. The Defence Secretary will continue to have my full support because this is right and this is about bringing back deterrence. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's always good to follow the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the member for Rutland Milton. I actually agreed with quite a lot of what they had to say. I may be going to that a bit more than what I'm going to have to say in the next few minutes. It does, I have to say, seem strange to having this sort of general debate on a Wednesday afternoon during government time. A general debate on defence and security, which I think the Shadow Defence Secretary alluded to, has morphed into one on the situation in the Red Sea. A more current and certainly more substantive topic, but I have to say one which will still allow me to make the same points I was actually going to make in a general debate, but within the frame of what is beginning to look like, and I hope I'm wrong, but it was what increasingly looking like some type of long-term commitment. Now, those of us who do speak, Mr Deputy Speaker, on defence on a regular basis, and I see some familiar faces here today, can probably finish each other's speeches by now. You've probably seen it on the odd occasion. Whether we be colleagues from the Defence Select Committee, and I see the member for South Dorset is in their place, or ordinary members interested in the subject, we tend to be a very dedicated bunch. And while I certainly don't agree with everything that everyone has to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, I certainly always learn a lot from the contributions from the people like I see my right honourable friend, the member for New Forest East, or indeed I know that no longer in the place the member for Raleigh and Wickford. It is to say that when it comes to debates such as this, the last thing on a Wednesday, you usually have to actually care to take time to participate. And that's why it is, I have to say, from my perspective, frustrating time and time again that the rhetoric, it seems, of the government around our defence and security, with the current situation as a case in point, so rarely matches, again from my perspective, the action taken, and why I sometimes wonder if His Majesty's government pays so little heed to the contributions of those on their side of the House. Because the question is, who are they exactly listening to? But before I explore that much further, maybe add to what the Chair of the Defence Select, the Foreign Affairs Committee said, let me also state the obvious, that the Houthis are a movement is an obstructionist, anti-Semitic, theocratic death cult that has violated human rights and international law at every step of the way. And its current strategy not only continues these violations of international law, they seek to use the suffering of the Palestinian people in a way which cannot be justified. However, and this is maybe the point where I will distinguish my remarks not only from maybe the government but also from the shadow, the Labour bench, is that just because current events in Palestine are not the cause of the Houthi attacks on shipping, Mr Speaker, from our perspective, it does not mean that they are not symptoms of the same phenomenon, namely Western indifference towards the region followed by periods of intense military involvement. And little effort, I have to say, has been made to address longer-term issues. Now, I and my SNP colleagues gave the first round of strikes against the Houthi targets qualified support, Mr Deputy Speaker, earlier this month, and we do so again with the latest strikes. But as we begin to slide, I will briefly, but I do want to move on quickly.
I just wanted to probe him slightly on his comments about the West not being involved into the region until something strikes up, because it was the Royal Navy and it was other navies who were protecting shipping from piracy from Somalia. It's the Royal Navy that has bases in Bahrain to help support shipping through the Straits of Hormuz. The West is involved in the region. It may be highlighted more now, but I just wanted to clarify the Honourable Gentleman's comments that he's not suggesting that we have not been involved in the region until now.
I think it's an interesting point to make, and maybe he turns to the points made by his honourable friend, the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, about the diplomatic effort. And I thought her point about Arab-led initiatives was a point well made, and maybe the government should be listening to that as a future intention. I think that's more to the point rather than engaging in military action, which has been ongoing for some time. But as we begin to slide towards, as I was saying, Mr Deputy Speaker, it also seems inevitable to a longer-term commitment. It cannot be said enough that the what, the how and the why of UK grand strategy are, at least from my perspective, dangerously out of sync. Now, let's start with the Defence Secretary, and I see they're no longer in their place. His keynote announcement last week that the era of peace dividend is over and 2024 will mark an inflection point. Now, on the surface, this is a pretty banal observation. Whether we call it the polycrisis or we talk about the age of grey zone conflict, those of us who come to these debates on a regular basis have been talking about the possibilities of this type of thing happening ever since I at least arrived in 2015, and others from even longer. Now, I'm not sure how 2024 is going to be anywhere near the inflection point that 2014 or indeed 22 were indeed themselves. Nonetheless, it is a bold statement from the Secretary of State, and it's important to say that he also backed it up with an announcement of a £405 million investment in so-called drone-killing Sea Viper missiles. Now, on the surface, it would seem that the Secretary of State has got his why and his what sorted. We just need a how, and that's where I think we begin to run into trouble. Because for all of the highfalutin rhetoric from main building, I'm not sure there's anyone here who really believes that we're going to meet the how in the form of an increase in defence spending to meet these new threats, given the disastrous state of the MOD's finances as seen in the latest NAO report. Now, we are in the middle of a cost-of-living crisis, Mr Deputy Speaker, as we all know well. Inflation seems to be coming under control, is only worse in the defence sector. And the proliferation of the US dollar-dominated contracts is not actually going to make things easier, especially with a soft pound and with the reality that we are actually now living in one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. Any increase in defence spending at this time means a cut elsewhere in that budget. That's simply a reality. And while there are those, particularly on the opposition benches, who are brave enough to say that they would like to make cuts elsewhere to do so, I have absolutely no indication from the government that they intend to do so. Indeed, whilst I'm no economist, Mr Deputy Speaker, hard to believe, would you think, but I believe practitioners of that special art call this a revealed preference. When a potential leadership candidate, for example, advocates spending 3% of GDP only to quietly drop the commitment when they become Chancellor, all of our recent Prime Ministers, for example, have also made all the right noises when it comes to what the problems are in international security. But none of them, at least from my perspective, have met the challenge with a significant increase. Indeed, I think we can all agree that if that redoubtable and dogged former Secretary of State, and I have let him know that I'm going to mention him, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Right Honourable Member for Wyre and Preston North was only able to secure an increase of 2.5%, and even then only by the end of the decade, then I don't think anyone is actually expecting his successor, I'm afraid, to be any more successful. And I should point out, I say this is something of a sceptic about increasing the defence budget, or even the value in such arbitrary targets. We judge governments based on their record, and this is what this one has. Because once you start to scratch the how in the government's strategy, The what and the why also start to become unstuck. Now let's take the Sea Viper order, what was presented as an announcement to counter the new and specific threat has actually been on the table since 2012, only to be, if my honourable friend will allow me just for a moment, only to be consistently shifted to the right because of the pressure elsewhere in the budget. I will give way to my right honourable friend.
Him, and I regard him as my honourable friend too. Before he leaves the issue of percentages spent on defence, would he not agree with me that, crude though they are, these are indicators of a national priority? And the trouble is, if we don't spend enough on defence in peacetime, and then a conflict breaks out, and now we're beginning to hear talk of having to be prepared for major conflict in the next decade or two, we will be spending vastly more than 3 or 4% on defence. So how much better is it to spend a bit more in peacetime to prevent the conflict? And how much better than that is it that America should realise that investing in Ukraine's effort is also helping to raise that deterrence threshold?
Honourable friend for that intervention, because whilst I agree and I disagree and I don't disagree, because I think if there had been a sustained investment in the ministry on capability, we probably might not find ourselves in a situation, and of course he is welcome to stay for my adjournment debate on the nuclear infrastructure, where we might go into that, the number crunching in far more detail. I think you might maybe try and pass that one off. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, let me say, as far as being a simple drone killer in relation to Sea Viper, it is a sophisticated ballistic missile defence system that has been in development since the 1980s. And each Aster 30 missile cost £2 million a pop. Now, whoever in main building thought it was a good idea to call it a drone killer evidently hasn't done the cost-benefit analysis on taking out mass-produced Chinese drones costing £100 with a £2 million missile. Now, this is before we even get to the platforms delivering this capability. Now, the MOD is now officially refusing, and the ministers who are in their place might be able to correct me, refusing to disclose publicly the size of its escort fleet. Something which probably the Houthis probably already know, and maybe it's on one of the TikToks that the honourable member, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, mentioned. They're refusing to disclose the size publicly, something which got a bit of a play last week as well, although which should bring us pretty quickly to consider the why of all of it. If we can all agree that we are living in a world, Mr Deputy Speaker, of increasingly complicated and interlinked threats, then why is the Red Sea important to the UK in all of this? Now, I consulted two principal documents published since I have been an MP, the 2015 SDSR and the 2021 Integrated Review. Alas, the mentions of the Red Sea, there were none. Yemen was given a single cursory mention in each, and both in the context of other regional conflicts. I guess you could say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the government's defence that both were written before the Ever Given accident reminds us that the Suez Canal and the Red Sea were something of an important bottleneck for global trade. But ultimately, neither the documents, one pre and one post-Brexit, really tell a compelling story about UK engagement in this part of the world, which means it's harder for me, and certainly harder for the public, to see why sustained engagement, if it happens, in this is in our long-term interests. Now, don't get me wrong, Mr Deputy Speaker, even as a committed North Atlanticist who believes Scotland and UK's primary commitment should be our Northern European neighbourhood, I am open to being convinced. Instead, I have to say that the mood music all through this time has been around global Britain, without elucidating what that actually means. Now, don't get me also started on the issue of the Indo-Pacific tilt. When I first heard mention of it, and then when I read, quite frankly, incredible assertion from the Integrated Review that the UK wishes to be the European states, and let me quote, with the broadest and most integrated presence in the Indo-Pacific, I have to say I claim that received very little interrogation at the time. Now again, as a committed North Atlanticist, I was maybe never going to be on board with the idea of an Indo-Pacific tilt, but the more I tried to find out about it, the less convinced I became. The Indo-Pacific is a big place, home to 2 of the 3 largest oceans in the world and 3 of the 5 largest states. Any tilt towards it would surely require some sort of prioritisation, but we have never heard any talk of this. The Red Sea region could have been part of that, securing the freedom of maritime trade from the Indo-Pacific, bringing in European partners with a presence in the region along with others. But there was a complete failure to communicate any of that with members in this place, never mind with the general public. So forgive those of us who are sceptical about that, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In this instance, these strikes against the Houthi targets because we can clearly see that the how, namely the Royal Navy and its capabilities, and the team are doing a commendable job, is actually in its poorest and most diminished state it has been for many years. I think it was an issue alluded to one of the members, the member for Raleigh. It's a consequence not only of budgetary pressures, but a complete failure of this and previous governments to make the case for why, be that in the Red Sea or the North Sea. Instead, we have a manpower and retention crisis caused by over a decade of wage stagnation, the ongoing possibility that the 2 remaining LPDs will be mothballed, calling into question the long-term viability of the Royal Marines, and the admission in November that the entire fleet of SSNs was alongside at the same time. Yet, if you went by the MOD's spin on things, Mr. Deputy Speaker, all is well, because we can still field 2 carrier strike groups, even though everyone knows we'd never have the manpower to do so at the same time. The AUKUS deal will allow Astute-class boats to operate in the Pacific Ocean, even though, as we have heard, they sometimes can't even get to the North Sea. And who can forget from last week, we now have a space laser, or at least we will in 10 or 15 years' time. So let me conclude, Mr. Deputy Speaker, with a general observation. When it comes to UK grand strategy in the Red Sea, denial, I'm afraid, isn't just the river you end up in if you take a wrong turn on your way there.
As members can see, we've got 13 members that wish to participate, 14 members that wish to participate in this debate. So whilst I'm trying not to put a time limit on people's speeches, if they could show some self-discipline, then we will get everybody in with a decent amount of time. So, Alex Sharpbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Following on from the honourable gentleman who's just spoken, I find it disappointing in the approach he's taken to the operations that we have had to carry out in the Red Sea to protect international shipping. He makes the point, perhaps reasonably, that budgets of the country, its finances, are under great pressure, and that there has been a cost of living crisis. A cost of living crisis that has occurred through instability around the world, whether it be supply chains over the pandemic, or whether it be Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, and now the threats to shipping at the key point of entering the Red Sea. These do have a fundamental impact at home. And therefore, the investment in defence is not something that just takes money out of the pot that government needs to spend. It actually helps build the security that our constituents need. Too often through history, people have looked at distant lands and said, that's got nothing to do with me. And that today couldn't be less true. I mean, it never was true, but it couldn't be less true today when we look at exactly how global supply chains end up on our own supermarkets and, of course, in terms of the fuel prices. And it's not just the increase in the cost of shipping that will add to inflationary pressures. It's the fact that we're modern industry working to a just-in-time system that widget A may take 3 weeks now to get to widget B that may only take a week to get there, and that's going to cause huge backup problems of production within the factories and within production plants that move onto the system. So the actual time constraints that have now suddenly been hoisted upon global shipping of having to go around the Cape to actually deliver the goods that are needed, will end up having a direct impact on our constituents once more. And therefore, it is important, in my opinion, that we do invest further, certainly in the Royal Navy. Now, I will take issue with people in this House who want to do a disservice to the Royal Navy. I think the Royal Navy is one of the most advanced and finest navies in the world. We have replaced the vast majority of our capital equipment in this century alone. And the technical ability of our Royal Navy outdoes a great number of countries, including many of the capabilities that are produced in the United States. The Type 45 destroyer was a visionary destroyer and allows wars to be fought in a way that were not feasible before. And with the introduction of the Type 26s coming forward, the Type 31s, the fact we've renewed our hunter-killer submarines, we're renewing Dreadnought, we have a huge infrastructure along with aircraft carriers, which in my opinion have always had an important strategic point of view, especially when we are trying to operate alongside the Allies, and comment have been made that it's always the USA picking up the burden. I think that Britain punches above its weight by having that capability. Yeah. Where I do think we run into a problem through the MOD and its funding is that because of rules been set by previous chancellors and carried on about the difference between borrowing for capital and not spending on revenue and how that's worked out, that it's always been easy to produce a capital spreadsheet to produce more ships, but no one ever looks at, well, how much revenue are we going to need to keep those ships running, keep them serviced and crew them. And that in itself is something that does need to be addressed, because be under no illusion, the situation in the Red Sea speaks to the wider issue of how important maritime security is. It affects the entire world. And yes, we operate as part of the NATO alliance, and we can actually draw on many, many more allies around the world to help police the situation that's taking part in the Red Sea. But that demand is only going to get greater, especially to diverse just slightly from the issue in the high north, as that becomes more of a passage for trade during the summer months, with already China showing a great interest in those areas. And I don't think it can be dismissed of how there is an arc forming around the ability to disrupt trade and disrupt maritime, which all seems to emanate, or at least is influenced from Iran. It's already been mentioned about the influence that Iran is having around Houthis, around Yemen, and its issues with Hezbollah. But we know that it is also now arming Russia. We know that the Russians are doing everything they can to stop the grain getting out of Ukraine. Now, with the blocking of the bottom of the Red Sea, which is going to once again increase the ability to get vital food stocks to areas of the world, as mentioned, that is going to lead to starvation, and not least in countries such as Lebanon, which is an unstable country as it stands. It has a huge economic crisis, not recovered from the explosions at the grain silos. It's heavily reliant on the grain that comes from Ukraine. But again, that would suit the narrative to cause instability in another country neighbouring Israel and in that region from Iran's overall objective. And as my honourable friend for Rutland and Melton made perfectly clear, that it's these tiny activities that Iran take part in that doesn't lead to suddenly having to say we're not willing to tolerate that. I think we also have to be aware, though, that we always look at these issues with Western eyes. And actually, when those countries look eastwards, they have allies. You know, Russia has been able to trade with many, many countries to the south and the east of it, and Western sanctions only go so far. So, confident that other colleagues will want to speak and develop further. I think the situation in the Red Sea needs to be another flashpoint warning that we have to invest further in maritime capability, because it's only through maritime capability that we can ensure that we can keep secure trade routes open that affect the entire world. The investment that we make now has a direct impact on our constituents and their ability to deal with cost of living. This isn't a situation thousands of miles away. This is a situation on even the corner shops in our villages.
Andy Salter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The freedom of navigation and maritime security upholding international law are fundamental principles, and this country, along with international partners, has a duty to uphold them. We've heard about the economic consequences. The disruption caused by what is happening in the Red Sea at the moment is not only a threat to peace there, but throughout the region. But these are also, as the Defence Secretary and the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee said, these are complex and historic issues, and they will need political solutions to be resolved in due course. These are very long-standing disputes with very complex origins, whether that be the influence of colonial powers in the past, whether it be communal, religious, ethnic rivalries, whether it be the struggle for oil and other natural resources. And I don't claim to be an expert on this, but certainly there are parallels with what happened in the 1960s with the North Yemen civil war, the Aden emergency, which led to UK forces and occupation of Aden, which had begun in 1839, ending in 1967. Much of this does have very ancient origins. However, as a note of caution, and I hear exactly what is said by many speakers so far in relation to conflating the actions of the Houthis in Yemen with what is happening in Israel and Palestine. Nobody should be naive to think that the Houthis are doing this for humanitarian motives, that they are doing this for unselfish motives. They are entirely, I think the Defence Secretary said, opportunist in what they are doing in that way. That is not necessarily the way that it's seen in the Arab street. It's not necessarily the way that it's seen by our constituents, and so we have to address that issue head on. The priorities that are given to dealing with attacks on shipping in the Red Sea should also, many of my constituents say to me, be the priorities for dealing with attacks on human life in Gaza and where else they occur, including, of course, in the Yemen. And by that, I mean that, well, let's look at what the Prime Minister said, if I understood him correctly, at Prime Minister's questions today. He set a number of tests before there should be a ceasefire in Gaza, that all hostages should be released, and I presume he means Israeli and Palestinian hostages, that Hamas should disappear from Gaza, should disarm, should not be in a position to threaten Israel or indeed anyone else, and that the Palestinian Authority should take over the role of governance there. Now, nobody was more pleased than I if those three criteria could be met. And indeed, I'm sure that hostage release and swaps will be part of any ceasefire, even a temporary one. But how realistic is it to expect that Hamas is going to disappear overnight, or that, to use their own phraseology, that the Palestinian Authority are going to ride into Gaza on the back of Israeli tanks? I do not believe that is a realistic assessment of where we need to go before a ceasefire occurs. In a similar way, that when the government is asked, it often is, and indeed the Prime Minister was asked again by the leader of the Scottish National Party earlier on at Prime Minister's questions, does he believe that war crimes have been committed in Gaza? It's not a difficult question. Yes, it is absolutely true that restrictions are on journalists and on international observers going into Gaza are there, but there is enough coming out of Gaza to see, and it's not an exhaustive list, but many leading international jurists have seen deprivation of life, collective punishment, arbitrary detention, denial of basic services including healthcare, forced displacement and ethnic cleansing going on. And simply to reply, as any government spokesman seems to do now, and say that Israel should comply with international humanitarian law is not sufficient. The question is Israel complying in that way? And I noted that just today, published by, but the Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights, but authored by independent jurists, more than 200-page opinion, which found that in Gaza, the crime against humanity of persecution had been committed more intensely since the 7th of October, but going right back to the siege of Gaza began in 2007. And if the government's position is to be credible on this, then it has to address those events, because what is happening in Gaza at the moment is quite extraordinary. 1% of the population killed in 3 months, 25,000 people, under the most horrific circumstances that we heard from the Shadow Defence Secretary describe in his opening. Indeed, there are strong parallels between... I will give way, my friend.
The international law point. There is one thing that is the international humanitarian law, and let's face it, that is not a good law. That is a law of last resort when other things have gone wrong. The other side to it, perhaps the side that we can take as politicians, is the side of morality. What is the right thing to do? What is the humanitarian thing to do? What is the human misery thing to do? And that is why the immediate bilateral ceasefire is so important. There is a choice. They can, the ICJ, the ICC will be looking at the war crimes, and I think it's right to let the courts do their job. But the government could have also taken a moral judgment. Is this right? Would he agree with me?
Yeah. I think I always agree with my friend on this issue, not on other issues, but on this issue. And she's absolutely right, and she has some very personal, clear knowledge of this, and she is herself, because of where her extended family are in Gaza, under particular strain. And I pay tribute to the fact that she is able to continue to maintain the objectivity that she's just shown in the comments that she's made.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will briefly.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. We've just had a debate in Westminster Hall, which was specifically on human rights, and Gaza obviously came up, and it was revealed during that debate that the Foreign Office had sought evidence from their legal advisors as to legality of actions that have been taken by Israel. Going back to the 10th of November, we didn't have a satisfactory answer actually from the Minister at the debate. But if that is the case, should the government not be publishing that advice? And I understand since the new Foreign Secretary arrived, he's also asked for a review of that legal advice.
I can only say that I agree also with my honourable friend. The number of deaths that are occurring on a daily basis and continuing to occur, mostly so far through military action in Gaza. But now we've reached the point where the number of deaths through privation and disease are overtaking that. And there is a strong parallel here with what happened in Yemen. About 150,000 people, mainly civilians, have been killed in Yemen over the course of the civil war that began in 2014. About another 200,000 at least have died through disease and privation as a consequence of that civil war. And we are at that tipping point in Gaza now. And yes, those are higher numbers, but over a much longer period of time. But many of the same arguments apply, and I don't think there is any member in the chamber tonight who would not wish to see the end to the suffering, both in Yemen and in Gaza. What needs to happen is a ceasefire, an end to hostilities, and pressure from the UK alongside partners could play a much bigger role in achieving that. What secondly needs to happen is aid and reconstruction, but that does need much more of a permanent peace, because many of the donors who have contributed, including EU and UK donors, to that reconstruction in the past, have seen that money then wasted by further military action in that way. And what's also needed is better governance and the support for civil society. And one of the most cynical things that's happened since the terrible and tragic events of the 7th of October, and we all feel for the people of Israel and what they suffered then. But the response in terms of not just going after Hamas, but destroying not just civilian neighbourhoods, but civil society, destroying law courts, destroying parliaments, destroying records office there, appears designed to make Gaza ungovernable. And so that has to be addressed as well. One could say make exactly the same points in relation to Yemen. These are two of the great catastrophes going on in the world at the moment. So there may be points at which we do not want to link the two, but there are also clear points together. The exception to perhaps that, the point that goes further in the case of Gaza and in the case of Yemen, is that what we are dealing with in Gaza is occupation. And that puts it into a different category. I asked the Prime Minister yesterday, I wasn't surprised by his answer, but in the statement yesterday, I asked him when the UK will recognise a Palestinian state, and he gave the answer that will be familiar to everyone here. We will recognise the Palestinian state at a time that best serves the peace process. Mr. Deputy Speaker, that time is now, or it is nearly now, because it is impossible to have serious negotiations towards peace unless it is between two sovereign states, and notwithstanding the condition in Gaza and increasingly the condition in the West Bank as well. That has at least, let's not pretend that this is going to put those two countries, Israel and Palestine, on an even keel, but without, as a precondition of negotiations, the recognition of a state of Palestine, negotiations are simply not going to get off the ground. So I hope we see that change of position. There is a very strong support, not just for our military, but for the diplomatic initiatives which the UK is making in the Middle East.
I've given a lot of latitude to the Honourable Gentleman on this as he's focused on one aspect, but this debate is the situation in the Red Sea. If he could direct his attention towards that subject, I would be extremely grateful.
Yeah, Mr. Deputy, I should have taken your advice rather than the advice of the Shadow Defence Secretary at the beginning of the debate. But you interrupt me at an appropriate point because I'm continuing my remarks there, and simply to say that yes, there is strong support on all sides here, but it needs to go further, and in particular, Britain's historic responsibility in the region requires us to make that additional diplomatic effort.
Thank you for calling me, and I congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for Hammersmith, a very wide-ranging debate, albeit somewhat remote from the Red Sea, as you correctly pointed out, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I also congratulate my right honourable friend, the new Defence Secretary, who's not his place, and indeed the Shadow Defence Secretary, both of whom I think spoke with a great care and with great diplomacy and sense, and fulfilled, I think, precisely what this place ought to be about, namely Her Majesty's government laying out their views and the loyal opposition then scrutinising what they've done. Now, before I say anything else, Mr. Deputy Speaker, can I just say that I strongly support the strikes in the Red Sea, and all of the remarks were made by my honourable friends, most of whom are much better informed of these matters than am I. I strongly support those strikes, and I strongly support the way they were carried out, and I strongly support the reasoning for them. But if I may this afternoon just take a slightly different approach to these matters rather than the simply diplomatic and foreign affairs approach and military approach, to look at the way in which they were ordered. Now, particularly after the first strike, a great many people, including a number of people in this House, perhaps we'll hear from the Liberal Democrats later on, were of the view that it was quite wrong. The House should be recalled, it was said. We should have votes in this House about whether or not these strikes were justified, it was said. It was quite wrong that the Parliament should not have the opportunity to express our views on the most important matter facing us all, namely warfare, it was said. I'm glad to say that the government resisted those calls, and that the way in which the strikes were ordered seems to me, and I'll come back to it precisely why in a moment, to be absolutely right. Yeah. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've been talking about this subject for some time. Indeed, I wrote a book about it, I may say, so available in good bookshops near you at this moment, for some time. And when I remember in a debate, probably some 15, 20 years ago now, I expressed the view that it was wrong that the House of Commons should take a vote on going to war. It was widely greeted by scorn. Everyone said that's absurd, a ridiculous thing to say, they said, and we can check Hansard for it later on. And indeed, when the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Lord Hague, then wrote a long, extensive article on this matter, and he said, very straightforward, very simply, when we go to war, the House of Commons, the House of Lords must decide on it. It must be done by a vote. I'm glad to say that the noble Lord Hague, last week went through a Damascene conversion and has changed his mind on the matter, and now I think entirely supports my view on it. But equally, I think that the PACAC, who wrote a report on these matters, again got it wrong in my view. They said that they thought the House of Commons should have a vote before going to war, before deployment. Now, if I may, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I take a very stringently different view. I think there are a very large number of very important reasons why that should not be the case. First, it seems to me that all pretense of secrecy would, of course, by that means be destroyed. We'd have a debate in this place, and the enemy would know precisely what it was that we were planning to do. Secondly, we couldn't take that kind of decision without consulting our neighbours. It might well be that that decision was part of a NATO strike, or in this case, a joint UK-US strike. Are we really to ask NATO, or the United Nations, or the US to wait while we discuss the matter here? And then what happens if we vote against it here, but they vote in favour in wherever else it might be? And third, it does seem to me that we are galloping down a very dangerous road, that if we ask the Prime Minister to come to this House and to share with us the secret intelligence which he has in order to make these very difficult decisions, and to share with us the legal advice that he has, and indeed the strategic knowledge that he has, he would then be exposing many of our professional supporters to criticism or indeed to attack one way or another. It would be quite wrong if he did. I don't want to know the secret intelligence, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't want to know the legal advice. I want the right to scrutinise what the government have done after they've done it. Fifth, I think it's extremely important that warfare should not be politicised. If we vote in this House for either to go to war or not to go to war, that means that we as MPs are taking a view of it. We are sending people to war, squabbling amongst ourselves as to whether that war was right, wrong, or indifferent. That seems to me to be quite wrong from the point of view of the families, particularly of the families of those who might, for example, be killed, who then say, well, one party or the other took a strongly different view to you. Before I come to the final reason for my strong views on these matters, can I just point out to the House that of the 274 wars that the United Kingdom has taken part in, or England, I think, has taken part in since 1750, we have voted in this House on only two. Only twice in all those years have we voted on prior to deployment. The first time was in 2003, when Tony Blair asked this House to vote on Iraq, and he whipped the Labour Party into supporting the war, and the Conservative Party indeed was whipped, and I'm glad to say I rebelled against the whip. But nonetheless, we were whipped into supporting the war. What a bad decision that was. Quite the wrong decision. And the second time, in all this 300 or 400 years history, the second time that we had a vote in this House on going to war, it was before the Libya strike in 2013, or the Libya strike then didn't, I mean, it was a Syria strike, I beg your pardon, that didn't then occur in 2013. The House voted against it, and very much of the bloodshed and the corruption and the disaster we see in Syria to this day comes about as a result of that vote. America followed us the following day, and they equally didn't strike against the use of chemical weapons. That was a wrong decision made by this House, as in my view was the Iraq decision in 2003, and those are the only two occasions when prior to deployment we've had a vote here. My old friend disagrees with me. Right, old friend.
I'm afraid I do, but I agree with his main thrust, which is there is no doubt that the Prime Minister and the Executive have the right to take initial action and seek support afterwards. Having said that, though, in the case of Syria in particular, it has become a byword to say this was a wrong and terrible decision because the ghastly Assad remained in power. However, the alternative to that would have been another Islamist swamp such as we saw in Libya, and it was because there was a strong feeling in the House that this would have been another Iraq or another Libya, that there was such pressure to have a vote, and for my part, I think the result was absolutely right.
Well, right honourable friend makes an extremely interesting point. He thinks that we should have not have had strikes against Syria, and therefore he thinks we should have had a vote on the matter, because the vote then went against it. But let's imagine there was some other war, some very important war, some very essential war. Let's imagine this was a moment before a general election. Let's imagine there was a very small majority on one side or the other. that war then becomes political. And my right honourable friend might well find, under those circumstances, that a war that he strongly believes in, that strongly wants to support, is voted down by this House rather than by the generals or the Prime Minister. Of course.
Perhaps both my honourable friend and my right honourable friend will agree on this point, that while it can be risky and dangerous to intervene, we also know that it can be dangerous and risky not to intervene. Perhaps that is a point that they would both agree on.
My right honourable friend makes an extremely good point. And incidentally, I forgot to mention, I'm very much welcome him to the front bench. He's doing a very good job standing in for the Foreign Secretary. But I hope you will take note of the Procedure Committee's report this afternoon on this question of how a Secretary of State who is in the House of Lords should or should not be questioned by this House. And I very much hope that the Government will accept what the Procedure Committee have proposed, namely that the Foreign Secretary should be called to the bar of the House to take questions on that matter. We mustn't probably get too far off the subject, but of course.
Actually, I think I'm very. So I thank my friend from giving way, and I think actually I support what he says. I think if you look at the two times that we voted on military action, both times, either one we were misled, and secondly we were stung by being misled, so we went the wrong way. And actually, as someone who was quite close to the Libyan conflict, because I saw it play out with ISIS in northern Iraq. Actually, we should have taken military action on principle over the use of chemical weapons, and by not doing so, regardless of the outcome of the Syrian war, I think we just weaken this idea of Western resolve. And I know it's can be a bit of a cliche, but if you've got a red line and dictators then ignore it, you end up in a world of pain.
Both of my honourable friends are seeking to involve me in a debate about a matter that happened some 10 or 15 years ago, and which is well beyond the scope of the debate this afternoon. The point I was not whether or not striking against Syria was right, wrong or indifferent. The point I was making was that it was we in this House who chose not to. And as my right honourable friend from bench says, often not doing something is as bad as doing something. He's absolutely right in saying that. But it was we in this House, with our shortage of information, my honourable friend knows a lot about these things, I readily admit that I don't. It was we in this House that didn't have that information, didn't have that briefing, didn't have the secret intelligence nor the legal advice. We chose to take that decision. Now, it seems to me, Madam Deputy Speaker, that in the months and years to come, as it's an extremely dangerous world we live in months and years to come, we're going to see an awful lot of these decisions taken. And it seems to me that the way that this was handled this time shows that the pendulum which swung from the divine right of kings, where the king decides on his own in the Middle Ages, through to the time in 2003, indeed 2013, when we allowed this House to vote, albeit not necessarily sensibly, that pendulum has now swung back to precisely where it ought to be. Namely, that if we in this House take a vote on something, this House is by that means diminished. We cannot then hold the government to account. We cannot come back and say, you, Mr. Government, have got that wrong, because we voted for it. And if we voted for it, surely the Secretary of State will then come back and say, well, you voted for it. The whole point of our purpose here in this House, in this chamber, is to scrutinise what the government have done, hold the government to account, if necessary, to remove the government who do the wrong thing. Well, I'm trying to wind up a little bit, of course.
I am most grateful to my honourable friend. And he mentioned about the world becoming a more dangerous place. And we've known through the history of the NATO alliance that deterrent is one of the best ways that we can try and keep a peace. That's why we have the constant at-sea nuclear deterrent. Nobody knows where or when it may be used. So if we want to try and keep the peace, is there not strength in the argument he's making that there's a far greater deterrent if the decision can just be taken rather than giving 24, 48 hours notice?
I'm not certain that my right honourable friend, I congratulate him incidentally on his knighthood, has quite grasped the subtlety of the point I was trying to make, which is not so much as to about the substance of defence, but so much the way we take a decision in this House. And the point I was making was that if we vote on something, as happened to the Labour Party over Iraq in 2003, it then becomes extremely difficult to criticise the government for what they're subsequently doing. It's right that we should scrutinise the government. We should not vote on these matters. We should have huge debates, have statements, have debates, have votes after deployment. But the moment that we allow ourselves to be forced into a whipped vote in front of deployment, then we are by definition emasculating this House. It's quite wrong from the point of view of defence, and it's quite wrong from the point of view of parliamentary scrutiny. We demand the right to scrutinise the government. We can only do that if we don't vote on the wars.
I'm getting slightly anxious about time, and my advice is that colleagues should stick to a maximum of 8 minutes. If we can't achieve that, I'll have to put a time limit on, but I'd rather not. Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and you'll be pleased to know that I intend to be brief. Originally, I was going to speak out a number of issues, including the situation in Ukraine, but I am grateful to be able to comment briefly on the situation in the Red Sea and the region. As my right honourable friend on the front bench has indicated, Labour supports, and I support, the targeted and limited strikes on the Houthi military targets in Yemen. And we should be clear about the nature of those attacks by the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. Opportunist attacks, as my honourable friend from Hammersmith has just pointed out. And we should reject the Houthi claim that UK and US airstrikes on their positions are related to the conflict in Gaza. Nevertheless, there are things that we need to continue to say about the situation in Gaza. We watched in horror the attacks on the 7th of October, and we've watched in horror since then at the level of suffering and deaths in Gaza. We need a ceasefire urgently to end that suffering. We need the release of the hostages, and we need to urgently address the biggest humanitarian crisis in that region in a generation. People facing starvation, thirst, and without medical assistance. And I pay tribute to all the organisations carrying out humanitarian work in the most difficult conditions there. I've been getting regular updates from Medical Aid for Palestinians who do great work there, and the impossible situation that some of their workers have been put in. The situation made worse, of course, because Gaza is not somewhere that people can get out of, and I'd encourage the government to keep pressing the Israeli and Egyptian authorities to open the crossings for aid, but also to allow the people who need to leave to get out. And I've raised with the Minister a particular case of a constituent of mine whose wife and baby daughter are on the border at Rafah, and we need to keep pressing for them to be able to get out of the crossing and out of danger. On the specific issue of the Red Sea and the strikes on the Houthi targets, the UN Security Council was, of course, strong in its condemnation of the attacks on shipping by the Houthis, and we join that condemnation. As my right honourable friend said, we can't afford for those attacks to continue and go unanswered, and there is a cost of non-intervention. Freedom of navigation is an important principle, and there are innocent seafarers from around the world on those commercial ships passing through this vital route. And at this point, I think I need to declare an interest. I'm very proud of my nephew, who's training to be a commercial nautical engineer. He's working for Maersk, one of the companies whose ships have been attacked. And as any family member would from any country, I want him and workers like him protected from terrorist attacks if he should have to make a journey via the Red Sea. Innocent commercial shipping workers from around the world are put at risk by the reckless and illegal attacks by the Houthis, and those workers need protection, as our brave Navy personnel need the same protection. And it may well be impossible to completely stop Houthi attacks. We know that they've been hardened, I guess, by the long civil war in Yemen. They've been subject to a long history of attacks by the Saudi-led coalition there, so they know about being attacked. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do what we can to degrade and limit their capacity to carry out those attacks. They can't go unanswered. But we also need, as a number of honourable and right honourable members have pointed out, a diplomatic strategy to stop the risk of escalation, making clear that these are targeted and proportional attacks that aren't aimed at escalating a wider conflict, and that is the thing we need to avoid at all costs. So yes, we support targeted action to protect freedom of navigation, to protect civilians and our naval personnel. But we need a political process towards a sustainable peace and regional security in Yemen, in Gaza and in the region. And I encourage the government to continue to work for that political solution.
Sir Liam Fox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I begin by paying tribute to all of our armed forces who've been involved in action in the Red Sea. They always rise to any challenge asked of them with professionalism and courage. And they're a great example that our armed forces are so much more than the hardware that we invest in. Now, I accept the point that the Secretary of State made at the outset, that there is no direct link between the conflict in Gaza and what is happening in terms of the Houthi attacks and shipping in the Red Sea. But we, I think, would be wrong not to accept that there's interconnectivity between the tensions in different parts of the Middle East today. And I think that we need to understand the context of that. Back in 2020, when the Trump administration brokered the Abraham Accords between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, and then Morocco, it was a great exercise in leadership to bring reconciliation to a part of the world that had seen too much conflict for too long. It has resulted in a big improvement economically in business and trade between the countries involved, and in people-to-people relationships, with around 500,000 Israelis, for example, visiting Dubai in the last few years, something that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. But there was always one country that did not want the Abraham Accords to succeed, and that was Iran. They did not want the Abraham Accords to succeed because they didn't believe in a two-state solution, because they didn't believe that Israel should exist. Ayatollah Khamenei has got tremendous consistency in his views about the purity of the Islamic Revolution, his detestation of the West, and his contempt for the existence of the State of Israel. Anyone who's interested should read the book Reading Khamenei by Karim Sanjapur for the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. Iran was never going to want to see peace between the Arab states and Israel because it threatened Iran's hegemony, as it saw it, over the Islamic parts of the Middle East. And the big question was always, what would Saudi Arabia do? A major player in security of both the Red Sea and the Gulf. And when I saw the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia on Fox News saying that every day he believed that Saudi Arabia was closer to peace and reconciliation with Israel, my first reaction was Iran will react against it. And whether it would react against it through its proxies in Gaza, funded and armed by Iran, Hamas, or Hezbollah, funded and armed by Iran in Lebanon, or whether it be funded and armed by Iran in Yemen through the Houthis. It turns out, in fact, we now see all three actually being active. And we need to understand that that axis of resistance, as Iran calls it, against the West, is something that they will keep going as long as they possibly can. They will not seek peace. They will resist peace at all times. Now, in the Red Sea, we are absolutely right, as many members have said, and I don't want to go over that territory again, to say that the Houthi threat is a specific one that we need to deal with. For the UK, 95% of our exports and imports go by sea. For the whole of the global trading environment, 15% of all global trade passes through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Not to act, as many members have said, would leave international maritime law in tatters, and with no deterrence there whatsoever, it would risk a bout of global inflation. We saw what disruption could do from the conflict in Ukraine. The same would be true were there to be permanent disruption in the Red Sea. And we would have disruption of vital supply chains, including food and medicines, that so many people will depend upon. So we're right to take the action, but we need to come back to understanding the role of Iran in this process and other processes. We have seen Iran develop drones sent to Russia by Iran Air to oppress the people of Ukraine. And yet Iran Air still fly out of Heathrow Airport in the United Kingdom. Why? Why is it tolerated? We've seen the money moved around the global financial system by Iran to fund its proxies, but we've still got two Iranian banks trading in the City of London with us within a stone's throw of the Bank of England. Why? Why is that happening? We've seen, as my honourable friend, the chair of the Select Committee, said earlier, we've seen videos of anti-Semitic speeches by IRGC generals now being investigated by the Charity Commission. The regulator is looking at footage of Death to Israel chants on an Islamic charity UK premises. And we've seen two of the videos showing talks by IRGC leaders talking about an apocalyptic war on the Jews. And again, as my honourable friend earlier, the IRGC actually took responsibility this week for a military attack on a foreign territory, something they haven't had the audacity to do before. So again, I ask, why are the IRGC not a prescribed organisation in this country? They are clearly involved in a wide range of activity that is dangerous in relation to Britain's national interests and our security. I have never once, when I've raised this issue in the House, been given a clear answer from the front bench as to why we will not ban Iran Air, why we will not stop Iranian banks in the city, and why we will not prescribe the IRGC. I live in a little bit of extra hope that we might get some answer tonight. Very briefly, I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you. The answer that the government so far has given on the IRGC is that because it's an arm of the state, it is very difficult to prescribe an arm of the state. I'm not saying I agree with that answer. That's the answer given. Is there a way around it?
It's an answer. It's not a very convincing answer, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I hope we'll get better from my right honourable friend, who I know is well capable of giving us greater detailed answers than that tonight. We actually face a choice in the Red Sea and beyond. We are either going to deal with the political problems that we face, or rather than the rosy future that the Abraham Accords offered us, we can go back to 1971 with a radicalised generation in the Middle East and return to all the problems we saw, hijacks and Munich and all the things we thought we had left behind us. We need to drive a solution. There must be, as the Prime Minister said earlier this week, a commitment to a two-state solution, and it's not acceptable for anyone to put a political block on that. We need to see security guarantees given for both Israel and the Israeli people who have a right to live in peace and any future Palestinian state. That will require an international peace agreement. It will require the United States and Saudi Arabia and others all to be willing to commit to that peace. It will require a new way of looking at the politics in the region, and it is right that Hamas cannot be part of that if there is to be any way forward. And there will need to be massive economic reconstruction in the area as we go forward. And if I, to end, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I can just say what I said before in the House, and that is when we look at the whole region, that peace is not just the absence of war or conflict, but the freedom from the fear of conflict or oppression or terror. It comes with concepts of rights that have to apply to all people, and not just rights and dignity, but enforceable rights and dignity. And only when all the people of the Middle East, the wider region, can actually have access to all of these do we have any chance of achieving the peace that is not just part of their security, but part of our security.
Leila Moran. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's an honour to follow the right honourable member from Somerset, because I agree so much with what he just said, and in particular, the way that he's set out how Iran, decides to back many different groups that will cause chaos, and actually the root cause here needs itself addressing. And it feels that when you talk about the Middle East, whilst I am half Palestinian, we lived in Jordan for 5 years just after King Abdullah passed away. We were in Egypt just after the Arab Spring. And so my link to the region is not just by blood, we were there. It feels like you're playing 3D chess while spinning round most of the time, trying to understand who's in, who's out, what's happening. And it's fair to say that the region has been poorly led and poorly served by its politicians for very many decades. Arabs are proud, intelligent, capable people who have every right to live in dignity and security as anyone else. And I'm sorry to say that there have been elements of the debates around Israel-Palestine that seem to forget that. When we talk about peace in the region, we often omit that Palestinians need to be at the heart of it as much as Israelis. And that when we talk about Arab-led, yes, absolutely Arab-led, and I should have drawn the House to my register of interest. I went to the Manama Dialogue at the invitation of IISS, but when we were there, we heard from the Bahraini foreign minister who made clear the case for why peace and two states was not just in the interests of Israel-Palestine, but actually was in Bahrain's interest as well. It was a regional interest. And the reason for that, and linked to what previous speakers had said, is because it is the biggest toy that Iran and other mischief makers in the region have to play with. And they've been playing with it for their own nefarious ends for far, far too long. And they have no real interest in the Palestinian people. And let me be clear, when I speak to other Palestinians, we know this. We know this. We know that they're jumping on the bandwagon now, and we talk about still the paper tigers of the 60s. And, you know, lots of Arab states will say, when it's convenient for them, that they will come and ride in our defense. And when at that final moment it comes to who backs us, the answer is, well, no one. And so we rely on ourselves. And that's the view from pretty much every Palestinian I know. But that said, that doesn't mean we don't need help. So this is my plea for help. 2 states is not just in the interests of Israelis and Palestinians. And can I just emphasize Israelis as well, because the peace camp in Israel has taken an enormous blow as well in this. It was, let us remind ourselves, very many peace activists who have been taken hostage, who were disgracefully raped. Hamas is no friend to the Palestinian cause either. But this war has driven ordinary, peace-loving people into the arms of the extremes of the debate. And when you look at the polls, and there was one done by, I believe, very recently, it is the people are now backing Hamas, are now backing Netanyahu, when before they didn't. And we have to reflect on that. Why has that happened? These are the same people as before October the 7th. And the reason why that's happened is because we've allowed it to happen. Because the longer this war is waged in the way that it has been waged, in the way that it feels so one-sided, with the humanity at the center of it, not at its heart, by the Western world in particular, the more abandoned ordinary people feel. And when people feel abandoned, that is when the center ground where the dialogue happens is vacated. And so my plea to this House continues to be, let's not forget the Palestinian cause. And yes, I'm here with my Palestinian scarf, with my blood, but it's not for me. It's for regional security. And I would put it to the Minister that this is in the security interests of Britain, because we are seeing for ourselves. Now, when we say that the region is a tinderbox, what we mean by that is not that one thing is causal on another, is that there are multiple flashpoints, and all it takes is for one thing to go wrong, and you find they all blow up at the same time. So the reason why, and this is why the debate and vote earlier on was important, it is of course true that the Houthis were wanting this to happen and it wasn't linked. But that risk of escalation is very real. There is a very true concern, and I think a legitimate concern, that it's true, you have to act, and not acting is also acting. And we back what the government has done. But what happens if it does start to go wrong? What if that nuclear reaction starts to get out of control and you end up in a situation where that tinderbox has been set alight? And the worry I have is that whenever we have questioned the Prime Minister on that point, how do you come off this particular ledge? We have not had that assurance. What's the plan? We still don't have that plan. And 2 plans. Recognition of the state of Palestine, I would argue, has never been more important. Because I talk about an immediate bilateral ceasefire to bring the people from the extremes back to the center, to start to heal some of these wounds. But I also would point out that a ceasefire is not the end. A ceasefire only ever freezes a conflict. And if we want to say that this is the last time, and I sincerely believe that across this House there is broad agreement on that point, we need to get serious about how we bring 2 states not just back on the table, but back on the table quickly. Because you just have to look at what's happening in America and the chances of Trump coming back, and that means that our window of opportunity, not just public opinion, which is at its height now, but also an America that is willing to be a willing partner, is fast diminishing. So we know that the European Union is talking about a conference. We know that the Arab states are also talking. And my question to the Minister is, who are we talking to? How quickly do we think we can get this twin track, whatever you want to call it, off the ground? And as part of that, may I urge him, as I've done in previous debates, to recognize Palestine sooner than later. Because us Palestinians, wearing my Palestine hat back on for a moment, all we want is the power to do what all other countries have. We want our own votes at the United Nations. We want to raise our own money to rebuild and educate our children. And it's not a case that we aren't capable. We just don't have the tools. And what we want above all, however, is to live in dignity alongside our Israeli cousins. It is the scars that so sadly we share that will bind us together. And like scars, they're not comfortable, but quite often when the bone grows back, it's stronger than before. That's how both people feel. They need to be given the tools as equal partners to be able to resolve this. And without a fully fledged recognition of the Palestinian state very early, I would argue first, not last in the process, we will never get there.
Flip Drummond. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's an honour to follow the Honourable Lady from Oxford, Western Abingdon, and I think she spoke very wisely on many of the issues, and I suspect the Minister will have listened to that carefully. I want to start by thanking all our personnel who are currently operating in the Eastern Mediterranean and east of Suez. Even in peaceful times, this is an area which calls for the highest professionalism and alertness. And when we're faced with the challenges that we have now, the stress on them is even greater. Our interest in the area around Yemen predates the Suez Canal because of its place on our original sea route to India around the Cape. The Aden Protectorate, where I was born, was a major trading base which has continued with 15% of the world shipping and 30% of global container traffic depending on the freedom of the navigation in the Red Sea through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. We must be realistic about the motivations of the Houthis in these attacks and their piracy. The forgotten civil war in Yemen has been going on since 2013 with a ceasefire in place for much of the last 15 months. Yet Yemen, and even more so the Houthis, only seem to have exploded into our consciousness of this country with the attacks on shipping, although it is debated in this place regularly. The ceasefire in Yemen has not been perfect, and acts of violence have been carried on at a low level. The Houthis have gained much from the peace talks, although they have an appalling human rights record, using sexual violence against women and the exploitation of children, and the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee talked about a few more of those. But I am concerned that the entire ceasefire is now jeopardised because of the Houthis' actions and our response. Additionally, the Houthis are clear that they see a linkage between their actions in the Red Sea and the situation in Gaza. And I say to them, attacking ships will not help the Palestinian cause. Targeted strikes by the US, the UK and allies will continue to protect shipping. However, the consequences of a prolonged series of strikes of the Yemeni people will be appalling. I cannot stress enough the catastrophe that will follow if the Houthis shut out humanitarian aid, if the ceasefire collapses or if navigation around its coast becomes impossible. Yemen imports 90% of its food, and there are already 17 million people at risk of famine. 70% of the Yemeni population live in the areas that the Houthis currently control. And financing of the UN Humanitarian Response Plan has dropped from 55% of requirement in 2022 to 38% in 2023, and it's not even been announced for 2024. Most of Yemen's imports come through the Hodeidah port, so if the port becomes inoperable, the consequences will be severe. I urge extreme caution about any move to proscribe Ansar Allah because of the risk of destroying humanitarian effort which could follow. 50% of humanitarian funding comes from the United States, and most of this is needed in Houthi-controlled areas. I know the United States has been mindful of that in applying its special designation on the Houthis, and I'm sure, having raised it with the Prime Minister yesterday, that our government will be cautious too. Even with the ceasefire in place, the threat has remained to everyone in Yemen because the economy is so badly damaged. Collapsing and insecure societies breed radicalism and become threats to global security. So we must keep up our diplomatic efforts to save the ceasefire, and we should be cautious about seeing Iran behind every action the Houthis take. Iran does not have full control of their actions. They very much act independently, although they could stop providing intelligence, weapons and finance and work towards a de-escalation in the area. The Houthis are an organisation which includes many people who defected from the previous Yemeni regime, sadly trained and armed by the West. There are remains of Western munitions being used against the coalition supporting the Yemeni government. The Houthis have cooperated with the UN on the tanker Safa, which posed a huge pollution threat to the entire Red Sea, and they've been allowing humanitarian agencies to carry on their work. So it's very concerning that they're now threatening to shut these agencies out. Equally, we must make sure that any sanctions we impose do not stop humanitarian access. The UK has been a leader in aid, and I'm grateful to the government for its support for the Yemeni people. But I also want to pay tribute to the UN Special Envoy, Hans Grunberg, who I met last year and who is working incredibly hard for a final peace process. How we respond to a crisis at the pinch points either side of the Bab el-Mandeb will be watched by other potential aggressors eyeing other opportunities. This is a key test of our return east of Suez. It is a strategy which commits us to respond to threats in the Malacca Strait, the South China Sea, or the seas around Taiwan. It requires our alliances like AUKUS to be military effective and not just defence export opportunities. Those alliances need to be founded on a belief by our partners that we will show up to bolster them when they're at the first line of defence. But we can only project power from a secure base in the UK, and we're responding to our personnel challenges with the excellent work done by Rick Haythornthwaite. However, we need to see results, and the major issues of service accommodation persist along niggly things like lack of free access to Wi-Fi on bases. Our personnel need secure and happy families' lives at home, and when they deploy, their effectiveness depends on knowing that their loved ones will be cared for. If we want people to fight for our values, we have to make sure they feel valued themselves. Ships, tanks and aircraft without crews are useless. Finally, while we are right to act to deter Houthi violence against international shipping, I do urge the House to remember that this is one chapter in a long and tragic civil war. So far, our attitude towards it has been supportive of the Yemeni people who are suffering so much, and I hope that will continue.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady from Meon Valley, and I hope the Minister, indeed the House, has listened to her wise insights. I think, there's a broad consensus around this House that we are absolutely right to take action to defend international shipping. The Houthis have been called out this afternoon in this House, and it's right that they do so. And of course, we also need to recognise the humanitarian crisis that exists in Sudan, in Yemen, and the wider security concerns that we have in the region. There have been no honourable actors in Yemen, and it's the population of that country that has suffered. Famine has gone hand in hand with war in that country. But yes, of course, as has been mentioned by others, we need to guard against any threat of escalation across the region. And we need to think about the nature of the threats that we face and the importance that we have, together with allies, of leadership, but not just leadership in dealing with the terrorist threats from the Houthis, but the importance of diplomatic action across the region as well. Acting together with our friends and allies in Europe, and of course through the agency of the United Nations, as has just been mentioned. We must recognise, though, the dangers of sleepwalking into wider conflict, not just here, and the bad actors that we face, the intentions of Iran, the challenges that we face with Putin and Russia, the challenges that we face with China, and indeed with North Korea as well, and the importance that we must have in this House of making sure that we deliver peace and stability throughout the world. And when we add to that the threats of disinformation and misinformation, and of course the polarisation that has been seen through much of our politics, these are issues that go beyond the Red Sea, but it's important in all of this, whether we're talking about in Yemen, whether we're talking about in the Middle East, that we win the hearts and minds, because we have to challenge that spiralling regional instability. So today, when we consider the Red Sea, it has to be seen as part of a broader landscape around the world of instability and the geopolitical threats that we face. Whilst there is no link, as has been said by many others, to what's going on in Gaza, we need to reflect on what is going on there. And I guess that the awful events of the 7th of October last year will forever remain with all of us. And of course, there must be peace and security for Israel. It is the time, though, to recognise that Palestinians have rights and the Palestinian state must be recognised as well. And dealing with that threat and removing Hamas does not mean to do so that you have to flatten Gaza. And of course, we're now living with the humanitarian crisis that we see as a result of that. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, it should shame all of us that we're now talking about in excess of 25,000 Palestinians that have perished since last October. Innocent civilians, but being targeted for what? And we must not lose sight of the legitimate rights of the Israelis and Palestinians to find peace and harmony together. To deliver that two-state solution is the only way of resolving conflict in that war-torn region. And we must now redouble our efforts to make sure that out of this crisis that we do deliver that peace, that we do deliver hope for the Palestinians, for the Israelis and for all of us. Madam Deputy Speaker, over the last few months we've watched the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees seeking to continue its valiant efforts to provide sanctuary for people in Gaza. And sadly, too many UN personnel as well as civilians have lost their life during this conflict. Whilst the UN humanitarian agencies have done their best on the front line, the UN Security Council has been paralysed, as it has been for decades, through the power of veto. And the time has come, however, to provide proper leadership to question how these agencies should operate. How should we get the collaboration which is necessary to deal with the challenges in the Red Sea and Gaza and elsewhere? Mr. Speaker, Deputy Speaker, we need to recognise that the effectiveness of the UN in delivering has been blunted by the power of the veto. It would be my contention that the UN faces barriers that inhibit their delivery at the core of this, and I would argue it is the leadership that is so often lacking, and the determination by the Security Council through the use of the veto by any of the 5 permanent members is a problem. When we consider the provision of the veto was not part of the UN Charter, it is right that we now question its use. When we consider that this power only sits with the 5 permanent members, we have to question the suitability of the existence of that power. Surely it is time to reform the Security Council and its membership, and it's most certainly time to remove the power of the veto. And let's remember that there have been 4 resolutions that have been stymied on the subject of Gaza over the course of the last few months. We must remember that when we look at conflict around the world and the influence of bad actors, be they Iran, Russia, the threats of China and North Korea, present to maintaining world order. The challenges in the Red Sea cannot be seen in isolation. We face multiple threats across the globe, and we must remind ourselves that in Europe, Ukraine must prevail against Russian aggression. We need to work in the spirit of collaboration within Europe, with our NATO allies, and globally through the United Nations to support Ukraine. We also need to recognise that democracy itself is being pushed back and under attack in so many parts of the world. Tellingly, when so many in the world face elections this year, faith and trust in democracy, and let us be under no illusion, democracy right around the world is under threat, and the electoral cycle this year has enormous implications for cooperation, for peace and security. That importance of democracy in providing peace and security, but also linking this to economic prosperity, dealing with the challenges of climate change and making this an opportunity for sustainable economic growth. That is important here, it's important in Yemen. And of course for us, NATO has been instrumental in providing peace and security in Europe, but now we face a threat of decoupling with our largest ally in the US on the back of indifference from political leaders in that country. Madam Deputy Speaker, when political leaders in the US are questioning supporting the cause of peace and stability in Europe from Russian aggression, alarm bells should be ringing. The question of UK and European leadership and the need to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine ought to be self-evident. We need to recognise that taking for granted of the US being an ally to Europe against Russian aggression in Ukraine may no longer be the default position, and we need to provide the support necessary to enable Ukraine to prevail. Ukraine must ward off Russian aggression, for failure to do so is not just a threat to the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine, it is a threat to the rest of Europe. What does it mean for us on these islands? Europe and all of us in these islands need to think about our own strategic autonomy, and thought has to be given to the mechanisms and forums that allow this to take place. The first and pressing priority is supporting and arming Ukraine. The central question has to be, what it will take for Ukraine to restore its sovereignty and independence and how it does this. We must go beyond the necessary announcements of support for now to thinking through the strategic initiatives that will help Ukraine to win. Putin can never win. Put simply, we provide the resources for Ukraine to win, and they in Ukraine provide our peace and our security in Europe. That's the deal. Failure to secure Ukrainian freedom takes us into territory that our wider freedoms in Europe and around the world are under threat. And emboldened Putin pushing his expansionist agenda. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have argued that in these islands we have a part to play in showing leadership with our partners and allies in Europe. We have a mutual self-interest in strengthening the capabilities of the United Nations in these challenging times. The risks to peace and security are at a level we have not witnessed since the Second World War. The situation in Europe with the people of Ukraine bears the brunt of Soviet aggression. The crisis in the Middle East and Gaza with the potential for an ever-widening conflict. Unrest in many parts of Africa. The drumbeat for war is ever increasing. Democracy is under attack and indeed in retreat in much of the world. Intolerance and division are on the rise. We have to be a voice for good, a voice for reason. Standing up for tyrants and seeking peace, security and stability in a fractious world is all our responsibility. That leadership is so needed here and abroad, and it is important in doing so that we have a full and informed debate here and that we seek to build consensus here and leadership globally with others. History will judge us on how we accept our responsibilities to deliver peace and security in the Red Sea and elsewhere.
To remind you of my 8-minute guidance. Bob Seeley.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll try to wind up after 7 minutes, mindful others want to get in. Lots of good speeches today. I just want to start by a reference to the Honourable Member for Oxford West and Abingdon. I completely agree with what she's saying about a two-state solution. And those friends of Israel who give Netanyahu and the Israeli right an easy ride on this are no friends of Israel, as far as I can see, because all they're doing is making Israel's long-term future significantly more precarious, because Israel's existence is accepted and guaranteed when there is peace with the Palestinians, and until there is peace with the Palestinians, Israel is always going to be under threat of some kind. Where I differ from her is her optimism. I mean, I would have agreed with her in the 1990s, but there is so much more awful water that has been under the bridge since then. And if Palestinian statehood, and I can't see a good reason not to do it now, but if you had Palestinian statehood now, and Hamas immediately took over that Palestinian statehood in the West Bank, it would simply undermine the cause of Palestinian statehood. So there is a very significant problem, and as the Honourable Member for North Somerset rightly pointed out, Iran is behind so much of this. And I just want to make a few points in the brief time that I have, but I want to make a reference both to the excellent speech made by my honourable friend from Meon Valley, but also echoed by the Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman. There appears to be a growing, significant, provable link between the use of proxy warfare, non-state actors, often used by other states, and the rise in conflict-related sexual violence, which in some parts of the world and in some conflicts is now endemic. And we saw it with ISIS, which is a non-state actor, arguably nobody's proxy. We saw it with ISIS in the use of Yazidi women as effectively as treasures of war, as the spoils of war, until they were raped to death. We've seen it with the abuse of Israeli women by Hamas, but Hamas is also increasingly intolerant an Islamist attitude to women in its own society, but we've also seen it with the Houthis as well. We've also seen it with Wagner in Ukraine, and we've actually seen it as well with Russian troops. So either you've got occasionally some state troops, some non-state actors, but also proxies, and there is an increasing link, an increasing casualness with which sexual violence is used in conflict, which I think should disturb us all. The world is moving to a more dangerous place, that is quite clear, and it's becoming more dangerous really since 2010. Putin declared his new Cold War back in his music speech in 2007. We didn't want to notice. Unfortunately, everything then has progressed really quite logically from Putin's point of view, although we have feigned surprise still. I don't know why we do. And since 2015, we now have a growing China problem with an increasingly intolerant regime under President Xi. There is a battle for humanity underway in the 21st century between open societies and closed societies, between societies where AI and big data is hopefully going to be used to improve the quality of human life, and in places like Iran and China and Russia, where AI and big data will be increasingly used to control people, control societies, and effectively, in an Orwellian state, to prevent people from even rebelling, because you'll be able to identify, according to algorithms, when they are about to rebel, when they're about to fight back and do something about it. And I think that is the bigger picture that we're dealing with. And I think what is particularly concerning at the moment is that we have, in several areas of the world, conflicts between united Axis powers, if I can call them that. So out of 3 potential conflicts underway at the moment, or about to be, Ukraine-Russia is a hot war, where the Russians believe that we are directly involved, although we believe that we are indirectly involved. But that war is fought in cyber and disinformation, in espionage, in poisoning. Some of that is happening in the UK and has been happening in the UK. In China, we have the South China Sea, with the expansion of China to try to take that sea territory, but also an increasing threat to Taiwan, and Xi has told his army to be ready to take Taiwan within the next 3 years, if I remember correctly. And now, in the Middle East, you have Russia's ally, Iran, as the member for North Somerset eloquently said, behind much of what is happening. Iran now has 22 proxies. In Bahrain, it has 2 or 3. In Iraq, it has at least 6, some of whom are rocketing UK and US forces. Where else? In Lebanon, it has Hezbollah, potentially its most powerful. In Syria, it's strongly aligned to the regime. So it's not a proxy, but the Syrian regime is heavily dependent, has been heavily dependent on Iran to fight its wars. And so throughout the Middle East, you have this sort of web that the Iranians have built up, and it is a very significant threat to us. And it says something about the changing nature of war, that although we've had conventional war that we prepared for, that we fought for, and that, or that we've prepared our armed forces to fight and to be able to win, hopefully, we have a very sort of black and white notion about you're either at war or you're not. You're either at peace or you're at war. And we are living in a world where effectively we are in a perpetual state of conflict with some nations. Russia sees itself in perpetual conflict with us. There will be periods of hot war, but there will also be periods of cold war, and we have to be preparing for that in a way that we haven't done. In Iran, likewise, Iran's proxies, we are effectively waging an indirect war against a series of Iranian proxies: Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, who's over rocketing us this week in Iraq. And so we have, and again in China, China's power is more economic, but even there they're using little blue men in order to seize territory in the South China Sea, as opposed to little green men that the Russians had in Crimea. So everywhere across the world, or in these key areas of this sort of almost pre-global war phase in the north of the Black Sea, so in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in the South China Sea, you are beginning to see a sort of forms of total war being waged by adversaries in those areas. Coming specifically to Iran, we had some very interesting evidence on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I shall wind up in a minute, I promise you. Recently, Iran is in many ways both more unstable and more powerful than at any time. It's got its 22 proxies. It is at any given time a week away from having the material to build a nuclear device, or it has the material to build a nuclear device. But at any given point, it would probably then take a week for it to be able to prepare a nuclear weapon. So that is the stage that Iran is at, and it is a potentially frightening stage. But at the same time, we know that Iran is very unstable. We know that their young people, especially their young women, are hostile as never before to the regime, and many people in Iran actually wish ill of their regime. So we are dealing with an Iran which is more aggressively adventurous in its foreign policy, in part potentially because of its weakness at home. What we need to do, Madam Deputy Speaker, is deterrence. And arguably, we have not had enough of that deterrence, and we need more. And various members have talked about that in greater detail than I've got time now. Summing up, I would just say one thing, and one suggestion to the Minister. All of these things that have been happening, the growing number of black swan moments, the growing instability in the world, is an argument for having a greater sense of strategy. So many people talk about strategy. There are so many think tanks in the UK dedicated to strategy. It would be wonderful to see politicians from all sides engaging more in strategic thinking. And one of my suggestions for Global Britain was, as well as having a National Security Council, which deals with current problems, that we have a National Strategy Council, which is always looking 5, 10 or 20 years ahead to identify problems as they come. Thank you.
John MacDonald.
I fully agree with that last point that the Honourable Gentleman made. I think we need those structures. Look, before you came into the chamber, I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, there was a debate about the nature of the debate itself and whether we should have a vote. I just want to address that. I want to make 2 points, address that issue and one other. We are at the moment taking military action in a region where virtually everyone across the House is warned that we could be in a situation where a tinderbox has been described as, where there could be other actions as well. And we're in a House debating that issue where there's just over 20 members of the House present. And I say this with respect and affection. Most of them are the defence nerds of the House of Commons, to be honest. And the reason that's taking place is because this is a discussion. It's not even a debate. And there's no decision to come at the end of it. That's why. And as a result of that, I actually don't think the House is taking its responsibilities seriously, because I think we're on the edge of real danger in that particular region that could spill over into impact upon the lives of our constituents. And if we're taking military action, I want to take some responsibility as a member of this House. And I want to be able to go back to my constituents and explain how I've exercised that responsibility. And that's why I believe we should have a vote. Now, I was in here one afternoon when I think there was even less members in here, when John Reid, if we can remember John Reid, came to the House and he reported to us that we were sending troops to Afghanistan. It was given the impression that not a shot would be fired in anger. There was hardly any debate, very little reporting back. We lost 400 British troops in Afghanistan and tens of thousands of others, and the war went on for over a decade. I was here also with regard to the vote on Iraq, and we did have a vote then, and the Honourable Gentleman said, yes, well, look at that, and we made a huge mistake. It was a huge mistake, but I think the mistake was actually it was a whip vote, because I think if it had been an unwhipped vote, we would not have taken that decision. I was also here, as was mentioned, the Honourable Member from New Forest mentioned the issue of Syria. I was here then. I think we made the right vote, because we could have been into another Iraq situation and still stuck there with a huge loss of life, but loss of British life as well as others. So that's why I do believe on issues like this, we should be able to have a vote and decide when we take military action. And secondly, we should exercise our own judgments on the basis of our own judgments and consciences, because there's no more significant decision can be made than sending someone out to potentially lose their life. That's why I believe we should vote on these occasions. Can I say there will be, I think, in the coming period, I think we will have to come back and have a vote at some stage, because my fear is this will go on and on and on. I also want to make this plea as well, unrelated to that particular issue. I want to make this plea. The International Criminal Court's decision, the court's decision on an interim decision will be coming out. Some have said today it might be out on Friday. I think it's important when that comes out we have a debate in this House, and we enables the government then to tell us what it will do in the light of that decision. And in the interim decision, there will almost certainly be some conditions that will be attached to the activities of Israel in particular. And it's important that we debate that in this House, but I also think it's important we have a decision-making process, i.e. a vote, on how we as a country can ensure that those decisions and the conditions are abided by and implemented. The second brief point I want to make is, time and time again, the Prime Minister and others have said there's no link between the Houthi actions and Gaza. I just think that argument is unsustainable. I agree with everything that's been said across the House about the Houthis. I condemn them outright. Their prognosis, the basis upon of their beliefs, as far as I can see, has to be condemned. Their actions in both Yemen and what they're doing at the moment has to be condemned as well. horrific, it's putting lives at risk, and they're undermining their own people themselves. But to say it's completely unrelated to Gaza, I just think isn't sustainable. It's been said, well, maybe it's connected to Gaza. What's happening across the Middle East is, my friend from Hammersmith and Fulham, Hammersmith said earlier, is what Gaza is doing, it's mobilizing the Arab street, understandably. People are coming away, watching this reportage of the human suffering. They're reacting with aghast about what they're seeing on the ground in Gaza. And as a result of that, they're putting pressure on their own regimes and right the way across for some form of action. And because both the US and UK have not taken effective action, that means that desire for action gets distorted in other forms. And that's what the Houthi excuse is for the actions now. Which leads us on really to, I think we have to accept our responsibility here. The Honourable Gentleman mentioned about the House being shamed by the number of deaths, the 25,000 deaths that have taken place. We're shamed by witnessing the operations and amputations of children's limbs without anaesthetics on our television screens. So we should be shamed, but we should be more shamed as well as our refusal to act soon enough. Because I think we were complicit with Biden in basically saying to the Israelis, you have more time to sort this out with military action than actually looking at a real strategic plan for the future. I think we have a responsibility because of our history over the last century and a half in this region, and therefore we should come forward with our own proposals now fairly soon. Some have been mentioned already. I actually do think the recognition of Palestine is important because that sends a message to Israel and elsewhere. If the Honourable Gentleman doesn't mind, I'm going to try to keep within time if I can. It will send a message to Israel in the future that they've got to come to terms with that reality at some stage. I secondly think, I know that people have said, well, we've got to get rid of Hamas, etc. I actually think the Palestinians, as soon as we can secure peace, should be given the opportunity to vote for who that leadership should be. And as a result of that, let them exercise democracy in that way. And I think people will be surprised about how the Palestinians will vote. So I think they will vote for peace. I think they will vote for those who are advocating peace. And it might give us the opportunity of consolidating the Palestinian people themselves because they've been so divided by Israel between the West Bank and Gaza itself. We need to be thinking creatively like that now before we, I think, blunder even further. And I just hope the government will now come forward with a more constructive plan. And yes, let us vote on it.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will keep to time. I've got two honourable colleagues and friends here who are going to give me the 7-minute bell, so hopefully I will keep with that time. Can I start by saying that I do strongly support the government's move and the strikes that they are taking in the Red Sea. There was a rather amusing headline and picture of one Lord Nelson in the Sunday Times at the weekend. With the looking glass placed to his bad eye, the words emblazoned across the top of the page were, "I see no ships." I think honourable colleagues can guess what the article was about, the lamentable size of our Royal Navy. Over a week ago, the Defence Secretary, to his great credit, kindly asked me to attend a major speech he made at Lancaster House. He warned then that we were in a pre-war period, I quote, with the West facing very real and growing threats from around the world, as we've heard in the House tonight. The head of our army is warning of calling up the public in the event of the war. That's probably the likes of me, because there ain't anybody else. NATO Admiral Rob Bauer went even further, prepare for all-out war with Russia. And Germany is predicting Putin could attack NATO in as little as 5 years. With all this very much in our mind, why does the Royal Navy only have 18 frigates and destroyers, with only a small number able to deploy at any one time? Having had the pleasure and honour to sit on our Defence Committee for 4 years, I could provide a number of answers to that question. But I fear many in the House are aware of them already and who do not want to labour the point. To be fair to the government, 13 new warships are planned and £31 billion have been spent on upgrading our nuclear submarine fleet. But we won't be seeing these for some years to come, and the threat is now. And as I've said, very real. HMS Diamond, the latest Type 45 destroyer, and her crew are doing a courageous and professional job in the Red Sea. They are an example of our armed forces at their very best, defending a vital international trading route where so much of our trade goes through, and our thoughts and prayers are with them all. I'm going to keep going if I may, because we're getting to the end and others want to speak. The enemy are a rag-bag bunch of rebels using cheap drones, which the ship counters with £1 million Sea Viper missiles and, we understood, 30mm cannons on occasions. This operation is exactly why we have a Royal Navy. Meanwhile, the RAF is flying operations from Cyprus, a round trip of 3,200 miles. Why, I ask the front bench. We have 2 state-of-the-art aircraft carriers lying in Portsmouth, equipped with the latest F-35 stealth fighter. It's true we have a few of those aeroplanes at the moment, but perhaps the Minister can explain why neither they or the aircraft carriers are being used. This very effective threat to a vital international trade route is sobering. These are Houthi rebels, and not some sophisticated peer adversary. What if it was? I accept in that scenario we be part of a NATO force with the US doing much of the heavy lifting. But this relatively minor excursion in the Red Sea is yet another wake-up call. For 13 years in this place, I and many others have called for more money for defence. For 13 years, various Prime Ministers have reassured us our armed forces are in good order and ready to fight. I have no doubt at all, that our brave men and women are ready for just that. But do we have the resilience, the numbers, the reserves, the ships, planes and armoured vehicles to fight a sustained conflict? If I may just keep going, forgive me, I don't want to go over my time. This debate is about the situation in the Red Sea, which puts the spotlight on the Royal Navy, which is so short of sailors that some ships are having to retire early. As both my grandfather and father took great pride in reminding me, the Royal Navy is the senior service, and there's a good reason for that. There is no doubt, Madam Deputy Speaker, that a very large fleet during the Second World War played a significant part in saving this country from invasion and keeping our vital trade routes open, not least to the US. The much-reduced Royal Navy again played a vital role in retaking the Falklands in 1982. Unfortunately, the peace dividend has continued to take its toll, and the Royal Navy is critically short of ships and sailors, to the point we are endangering the security of our country. Expenditure is all a matter of priorities, and this is where the government has to make priorities. Can we please have no more arbitrary targets on defence? I am tired of hearing 2%, 2.2%, 2.5%. Can we ask the military what do they need to play a prominent role in NATO and to defend our country and dependence? Once we have that worked out, we can then see what we can afford. If we can't afford it, I suggest we reignite the economy, get growth going, raise the tax revenue by lowering taxes and putting more money into our armed forces. So, let me conclude. I am within time. So let's adhere to the warnings, of a growing number of eminent people and prevent, Madam Deputy Speaker, the situation we found ourselves in 1939.
Hobhouse. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is undoubtedly our duty to protect freedom of navigation, not only for our own self-interest, but also in defending a core tenet of international law. The question is, how do we go about it? First, we must recognize the limitations of our short-term interventions and remain focused on the long-term peaceful solution to the civil war in Yemen. It remains the best route to stability in the region. Second, we must build durable and lasting coalitions to maintain freedom of navigation in the Red Sea and beyond. The Houthis have been engaged in a decades-long civil war. Even in the face of extensive aerial bombardment by the Saudis and the Emiratis, the Houthis continue to make territorial gains, import more and more sophisticated weapons, and fired rockets at Saudi and Emirati cities. All this while, thousands of Yemenis starved to death or were killed in the crossfire. Despite all their firepower, boots on the ground, understanding of the region, support from the UK and US, and ample political will, the Saudis and Emiratis have failed to weaken the Houthi movement. We should therefore be realistic that our actions will almost certainly not be a limited containment or could act as restoring a deterrent. All the signs point toward escalation. It would be foolish to ignore them. Therefore, peace offers the clearest durable long-term solution to Houthis' attacks in the Red Sea. In recent years, considerable progress had been made in negotiating a lasting ceasefire in the country. There was true momentum to talks which had reduced violence, ended almost all strikes in Yemen and in the Arabian Peninsula, and forced the Houthis to moderate their behavior. A negotiated peace to the Yemeni civil war remains our best hope for forcing the Houthis to abide by international law, let alone end the untold suffering in Yemen. But the brutal events of the 7th of October have derailed peace efforts. It is clear only our strategic rivals have anything to gain from escalating conflict in the Red Sea. Iran, in particular, has much to gain from crippling the peace process and demonstrating the havoc it and its proxies can unleash on international shipping. Peace in Yemen pulls the rug from under those who use instability and conflict to increase their own power. We must recognize that targeted strikes are highly unlikely to stop the Houthis in the long term, and instead we must redouble our efforts to kickstart peace negotiations. On that basis, our government should engage more closely with partners in the UN, the EU, and long-standing allies in the region. I would like to reiterate the importance of the UK upholding international law. However, the current American-led coalition is far too limited and looks too vulnerable to short-term political changes. If the UK is to remain a true defender of freedom of navigation, we must start building broader alliances. The USA is becoming increasingly isolationist and is tiring of its role as the world's policeman. This has been a trend going back to Obama and is embodied by the American First doctrine of the current frontrunner in the US election. While the Americans remain one of our closest aligned partners, we must foster other coalitions to be able to guarantee the long-term upholding of international law. There needs to be much greater involvement by regional powers in policing international laws in the Red Sea. So far, only Bahrain has joined the coalition. A coalition with greater regional and Arab involvement would undercut the Houthis' claim that they are supporting the fight for the Palestinians against America and the West. Greater engagement from big Arab states in defending international law would have the added benefit of not only making interventions more effective, but also create broader international norms that attacking non-military shipping cannot be a legitimate act of war. The UK should utilise its considerable influence in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi and Cairo to push those countries into joining these efforts. Additionally, we must engage with our European partner who have a like-minded, long-term interest in guaranteeing the free flow of global trade. Lastly, I urge the government to consider the global and successful fight against Somali piracy as a model for what a longer-term project to protect shipping in the region could look like. Madam Deputy Speaker, the situation in the Red Sea is unlikely to be solved in the short term by a few missiles. The government must therefore consider the long-term solutions to ensure enduring stability in the region.
Kenny McCaskill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I obviously rise to take a minority view within the Chamber, given the views of the representative parties, other than a few individuals, but it's not an insignificant view, I think, within the wider country. And that is that those who oppose an escalation in an area that is already a tinderbox, that worry about a lurch to war and seek instead a push for peace. And of course we condemn the actions of the Houthis, as indeed has been done, as people have said, by the UN Security Council, as we rightly condemn Hamas, because as I will go on to say, these issues are inextricably linked. But this is an escalation. We haven't been bombing Somalia. when it comes with regard to piracy or Eritrea. And although it's a while since President Obama launched cruise missiles on Al-Shabaab, it seems to be the Houthis that are being picked upon at the moment, albeit they are breaching international law and have to be held to some account. But this is an escalation against a country that is already one of the poorest in the world, in which this will inflict further harm. It is a country that has endured 10 years of bombing through Saudi Arabia, who have been armed with the finest munitions that the US and UK could provide them. And that hasn't managed to destroy them. Somehow or other, despite providing with all that equipment, at great benefit to many private corporations, the Houthis have continued to be able to do this harm and destruction. That obviously will continue because we've already had one set of strikes, we're now on to a second. How many more sets of strikes are there to be before either there's an escalation or indeed a call to halt? And indeed, we've also heard that I think it was the Minister himself who stated that surface-to-air missiles had been taken out. I don't claim to have any military expertise, but surface-to-air missiles don't seem to me to have any logical basis for the Houthis attacking shipping. That more appears to be related more to perhaps the USA and their defence of their own vested interests. But this is a lurch towards wider war. We have heard across the chamber, shamefully I would say, comments about Iran, conflict with Russia, conflict with China. I come from a family where my grandfather fought in World War I. My father fought in World War II. Both fought to try and ensure that their children would never have to fight in another conflict. I do not wish to see my children or my grandchildren end up in World War III. And yet there seemed to be an almost Dr. Strangelove tendency among some that are pulling us in that direction. And even if we don't go down that precipitous route with all the disaster that envelops it, then we also face the legacy of hatred that we've seen from Afghanistan and especially from Iraq. Because don't think that people will view this as neutral. People, not simply the Houthis, but people in the Arab world, people in the Muslim world, people in our own country will see this as one-sided, as judgmental, as picking upon one side, and yet failing to do anything about the issue that is fundamental to it, which is what is happening in Gaza. So we run the risk of worsening terrorism, both abroad and indeed homegrown. And indeed that then takes us on to why are the Houthis doing it? I think it's risible to say that it's not connected to Gaza. Of course it is. The timeline speaks to that. Trade was going, not without difficulties, but trade was going prior to the 7th of October. The timeline dictates that that was the cause of it. And indeed, the Houthis have told us in their almost webcam invasion or landing on the tanker, they even flew the Palestinian flag. It was reminiscent of when Britain put a helicopter and landed somebody so we could have a flag on Rockall. They made it clear that what they were doing related to what was happening in Gaza. And that is why, to get peace, as I said in the statement by the Prime Minister earlier in the week, you're required to look in conflict resolution, not simply at the manifestations, but at the fundamental root, and at the root is what is happening in Gaza. We have heard today that the purpose of the airstrikes is to preserve international law. Well, international law also covers stopping a genocide. We have heard from other speakers very eloquently pointing out that 25,000 Palestinians have died in Gaza. 1.1% of the population, 70% of them women and children. What would that be in UK terms? That in UK terms would be almost 750,000 people. 750,000 UK citizens wiped out since 7th of October. Do you think that that would be unnoticed? And yet, what has happened? We have said that Netanyahu is maybe going a bit far, that maybe Israel has to call it all back. What we should be doing is supporting South Africa and other countries in pushing this at the International Court of Justice. I believe and I expect that the International Court of Justice on Friday, as people have suggested, will rule against Israel. Because what Israel is doing is fundamentally wrong and we need to call that out. If we want to make sure that we get trade going, which we do, if we want to make sure that we protect seafarers, not so much UK seafarers, because there was no rush to protect the P&O workers when they were gruesomely treated, and most of those sailing on these ships, which only one I think was UK, weren't UK flagged. But if we do want to ensure that maritime trade, then we have to solve the problem in Gaza. That is where the solution lies, and that is why we must not have a rush towards escalation. We have to have a push towards peace, and in terms of enforcing international law, it's not enough to enforce international maritime law and the freedom of movement. What about protecting the rights of women, children, and even children who are having amputations carried out without anaesthetic? International law, you cannot pick and choose, and it's about time that the UK stood up for the rights of the Palestinian people.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Government for granting this debate, and I'm grateful also for the Defence Secretary coming at the beginning of the debate and setting out reasons for British military action in the Red Sea region. And I think he was right that this action was indeed limited, necessary, proportionate, in self-defence, using minimum necessary force, and for the freedom of navigation. I agree with all of that, and I think it is good that it was set out in that way. Where I take issue with the Defence Secretary is that there is no vote associated with this debate. I know a couple of other Right Honourable and Honourable members have talked about the business of whether there should be prerogative powers or whether there should be parliamentary approval for military action, and that is what I want to make the focus of my contribution. I think it was the Honourable Member for North Wiltshire who talked about how only twice in 200 years has Parliament had a say before military action took place. Actually, I'm not advocating for military action to take place following a vote. I recognise that there are plenty of occasions where parliamentary approval needs to happen retrospectively, needs to happen after the event. And just to give a few of those scenarios now, for reasons of operational security, for the deployment of special forces, definitely within the domain of the executive, not necessarily the business of the legislature. Our international treaty commitments, as the Honourable Member said, you can think of many scenarios, many emergencies, where there needs to be that executive decision and government needs to say what's going to happen without consultation in advance. But in those scenarios, there is no reason why we cannot then come back to the House and have a retrospective vote on that action. If that were happening today, I would very happily vote in support of the military action that is now taking place twice in the Red Sea. I will give way.
There are two problems with the retrospective vote. The first is that the action would already have happened, and therefore if the House voted against it, what would you do about it? And the second is that anyhow you're emasculating this House by asking us to vote for it, because we couldn't then, if we voted for the military action, how could we then criticise it? Only if we didn't vote, if we don't vote for it, can we do what we're doing today, which is scrutinise what the government are doing.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for North Wiltshire for asking those questions, and I intend in my contribution to set out the answers to both of them. Listen out for them. I hope he listens out for them, and he's very welcome to come in at the end if he doesn't feel that I've answered them sufficiently. Because if government is confident in our case, what's to fear? Why cannot we have a vote on military action if the government is confident in its case and makes that case in front of Parliament? I think, in particular, my concern is that this sets a precedent for the future. We've gone over many times today why this is the bread and butter of the Royal Navy. Freedom of navigation is something that we can be very proud the Royal Navy has done for us for hundreds of years. But this could set a precedent for a future military action where there is no prior vote and indeed no retrospective vote. I think it could be in part explained by the Foreign Secretary's experience, and others have talked about this afternoon, of seeking parliamentary support for military action against Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, but failing to get it. And I think the opposition of some MPs in 2013 was reflective of the concerns of their constituents. Our constituents, well, their constituents at that time, had a lot of concern or reticence. They reflected over the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and you could see the 2013 vote as an overreaction, over reticence, I think, perhaps. And we risk, under Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron, now overreacting in the other direction. I think we risk looking back at that 2013 vote and then deciding that we're not going to have retrospective approval at all. Surely the lesson from the 2013 vote is that governments must do better at explaining the necessity of military action, not only to MPs, many of whom are not experts in this area and would rather defer to people with more expertise, but also, crucially, to MPs' constituents. We need to convince the British public that military action is necessary, and that is particularly the case after the debacle of 2003 and Britain's involvement in the invasion of Iraq. I appreciate that there are times, and we've heard again the Honourable Member for North Wiltshire talked about situations where we don't have sight of secret intelligence, and therefore the executive needs to make a decision without consultation. I appreciate that, but I do think that still there is a scepticism amongst the British public about this notion of secret intelligence. You cannot know, you need to trust us. Again, it's the invasion of Iraq in 2003 that has led to a very cynical public on that subject. So the counterinsurgencies of the early part of the century have damaged trust, and to restore that trust, we need this Parliament, this House, to be able to vote retrospectively on military action.
No, don't.
At the end, if he may, at the end, if he may, what sets the UK apart, what sets our Western allies apart, is that we practice democratic control of our armed forces. This is all about, setting us apart from our adversaries, but we also need to demonstrate to our own service personnel they can be assured of the support, not just of their Prime Minister, not just of their executive, that service personnel have got the British public behind them. It's not just about support for the troops. We all support the troops. It's support for the cause that is so important too. We need to guard against a future scenario, and you can imagine this scenario, where a Prime Minister is threatened by dissent on his own backbenches. You can imagine a future Prime Minister who seeks to distract from domestic challenges by exercising military force abroad. You could call it domestic distraction. I have no confidence that every Prime Minister will operate with the foresight to anticipate what British military action might trigger in terms of escalation. Because, as Clausewitz said, war is a dialectic. In 21st century terms, the enemy gets a vote. This isn't just about the Houthi militia. This is about the Iranian sponsors of Houthis, of Hamas, of Hezbollah. It's about Russia, Iran's partner and Iran's customer. So we have to be cognizant of all of this context when we take military action. And for that reason, we need to return to the House and get parliamentary scrutiny and approval. I'm afraid... Oh, in fact, I will. This one.
I'm most grateful to you for giving way. Let's imagine that the strikes had happened, as they did last week and earlier this week, and let's imagine that we had a vote today on this matter, and let's imagine that the House voted against it. What would then happen?
I think that the point of a retrospective vote is it gives guidance to the Prime Minister and to the Foreign Secretary on what action the British people think should be made in the future. And this is very relevant in this case, because as we've already heard, these military strikes, these two military occasions where there were military strikes, are not likely to be isolated, and we are likely to see future British military action in the Red Sea. So, to summarise, when we talk about future British military action, I think the Defence Secretary needs to think carefully, not just about speaking softly and carrying a big stick, because at this stage, and we've heard this from members opposite, he risks having too small an armed forces, misplacing the stick and shouting. Thank you.
Before I call the Shadow Minister, I should say I'm concerned again that not everybody who contributor to the debate is here for the wind-ups, and it is really important that contributors do the courtesy of returning to hear the responses, because that's what it is. It's the response to the debate and the contributions that Honourable and Right Honourable members have made. So I just want to, I hope that that will be fed back yet again. Shadow Minister Wayne David.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today we've had, I think, an excellent debate. It's been, true, a wide-ranging debate on occasions, but it's been a thoughtful and frank and honest, on occasions, passionate debate as well, too. And I certainly hope that the Defence Secretary will take the trouble to read Hansard tomorrow to at least be aware of the excellent contributions which have been made. Could I say too that it's been very interesting listening to the contributions about whether or not Parliament should have a retrospective say, have a say on military action beforehand, and I'm sure this is a debate that we will return to in earnest in the future, and I give a commitment to read what I'm sure is an excellent book by the member for North Wiltshire. Thank you. I will make no comment about that. But could I say, I think this debate is seriously important, because I think we'd all agree there has to be accountability of the government for the action which it has taken. And therefore, I'm genuinely pleased that this debate has taken place, but I hope too that there will be debates in the near future as well. Indeed.
On the point of voting, which I think is ridiculous, in the Second World War, if during the bad period of the Second World War, when Churchill was very unpopular, if the vote had been taken in the House, I suspect in some occasions he might have lost. What on earth would we have done then?
Well, I'm sure members have noted your comment, and I'm sure when we have a detailed debate on this issue, that comment will be, I'm sure, weighing heavily on people's minds. But could I say that I think that this debate is important because accountability is vital. And as we've made clear on a number of occasions, the Labour Party supports this limited targeted action. And we do so because it is important to protect international commerce and to ensure that there is security for maritime shipping in the Red Sea. We uphold international law and believe that it would be quite wrong if we ignored the disruption to the flow of goods, foods, medicines and much else, as well as the threat to human life that is being caused by the Houthis' actions. And I certainly agree with the comments for the member for Rutland and Melton, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, agreed to by many members, including the member of Hammersmith, that the Houthis are truly an appalling terrorist organisation, and they're most definitely no freedom fighters. It is also worth noting that the Houthis' actions are harming Yemen itself, the country which has experienced the worst starvation in modern times. And as has been mentioned by the member for Meon Valley, 90% of Yemen's food is imported, and that is obviously clearly at risk. And let us not forget, too, that the Houthis' actions have terrible consequences on other countries along the Red Sea. Eritrea relies on fishing, farming and mineral exports, which all travel by sea. For Sudan, the Red Sea is absolutely vital for aid, which has come to a virtual end since the Houthis' attacks began. And further up the Red Sea, we have Egypt, a country experiencing severe economic difficulties. Here the country stands to lose millions of dollars, revenue from the Suez Canal, money which is desperately needed if the Houthis' actions were allowed to continue. Indeed.
Madam Speaker, I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman giving way. Just for the sake of completeness, would he also like to add that the Houthis have fired missiles into Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are both sovereign states?
Indeed, he makes a very, very important point, and that reinforces, I think, the essential point that action is not only justified and lawful, but is necessary to prevent this kind of violence and aggression by this ragtag of terrorists called the Houthis. Now, as of significant importance is the fact that the actions by the United States and the United Kingdom have logistical support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands. This is important because the international community must be and act as one. It is worth stating that those four countries put out a joint statement along with the UK and the US on Monday evening, and I quote from that statement. It says, "Recognising the broad consensus of the international community, we again acted as part of a coalition of like-minded countries committed to upholding the rules-based order, protecting freedom of navigation and international commerce, and holding the Houthis accountable for their illegal and unjustifiable attacks on mariners and commercial shipping." It is also important to acknowledge that the UN Security Council agreed a resolution that unequivocally condemned the Houthis' attacks. I'm glad the member for Manchester Wellington specifically referred to that. With Britain taking this targeted military action, it is important that this House recognises the professionalism and bravery of our armed forces. I'm sure we'll all be united on that. And I'm referring, of course, to those who are serving on HMS Diamond and those flying RAF Typhoons. Now, of course, we recognise that military strikes can reduce and perhaps eliminate the immediate threat to free navigation. But as a number of members have indicated today, there needs to be a wider political strategy. At the start of this debate, the Defence Secretary touched upon this, but I will ask the Minister if he would indicate more precisely and in greater detail what this strategy is. We all know only too well the horrific suffering the people of Yemen have experienced over the past few years. The terrible civil war and the appalling humanitarian crisis that unfolded as a result. The UK has a historic responsibility in the area. We are also a UN penholder for Yemen. So I would be appreciative if the Minister could elaborate upon the Prime Minister's comments to this House yesterday about what further assistance can be given to the people of Yemen to help alleviate their suffering. A number of members have referred to the terrible situation in Gaza. The situation is truly terrible. I do not accept, however, the Houthi claims that attacking ships from around the world is somehow linked to the conflict in Gaza. There's a desperate need for an humanitarian truce leaded with sustainable ceasefire in Gaza. And indeed, we must move as quickly as we possibly can to a two-state solution. That is in everyone's interest, as the member for Oxford West and Abingdon very clearly said. But it has to be said today that the actions of the Houthis in the Red Sea are an attack upon the international community and the rule of law. They should be seen for what they are. And let me be clear again. Labour supports proportionate airstrikes, but I would welcome clarification from the Minister on the points they have raised. Thank you.
Minister Andrew Mitchell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this has been a thoughtful debate and I think a united one, and I will endeavour to respond to as many of the points as I can in the time that I have. As my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, made clear at the start of this debate, the Houthis' illegal attacks on commercial shipping and British and American warships in the Red Sea are completely unacceptable. Despite repeated warnings from the international community, they have carried out more than 30 attacks since the 19th of November. And as I think all members and right honourable members across the House have said, this is unacceptable, illegal and dangerous, and it cannot stand. And that is why, amid this ongoing and imminent threat to British commercial and military vessels, and those of our partners in the Red Sea, the Prime Minister ordered the Royal Air Force to carry out targeted strikes against military facilities used by the Houthis, first on the 11th of January and then again on Monday. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, we acted alongside our US allies and with support from the Netherlands, Canada, Australia and Bahrain. These strikes, Madam Deputy Speaker, were limited, necessary, proportionate and legal. We acted in self-defence consistent with the UN Charter and in line with international law to uphold the freedom of navigation. Now, turning to specific issues raised in the debate, I'd like to try to respond to the speeches that we have heard, starting with the speech by the Shadow Secretary of State. He mentioned in his speech his agreement and support for what the government is seeking to do, and we are most grateful for that. He also called for a wider defence debate. And I completely take his point, but he will also accept that under the changes that took place, the government basically gave that time to the backbench committee. So the backbench committee itself is the most likely target, in addition to the government, to provide for that extra time. I will, yes.
But does my right honourable friend not accept that His Majesty's government has an absolute duty to provide debates in this House in government time to discuss defence? And just to say the Backbench Business Committee may or may not do it if someone applies for a debate is not enough. We want proper debates here in government time.
No, I completely accept what my honourable friend is saying, but I'm just pointing out that eating into that time has been the reform that has been made by to the backbench committees. I'd like to thank the honourable gentleman very much for his support for the government's strategy on Ukraine. It is a great strength that we are. I will in a moment. It's a great strength, I think, that there is full and total unity across the House on that matter. He asked me about the two LPDs, the landing platform dock, Albion and Bullock, and he asked for an undertaking that they will not be scrapped. I'm able, on behalf of the government, to give him that undertaking that neither of them will be scrapped. And I know that this will come as a relief to the great friend of many of us, particularly on this side of the House, Lord Llewellyn, who is His Majesty's ambassador to Italy and who is the honorary ship's captain on HMS Albion. I'll give way first of all to my honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend in giving way. He was covering the point about the United Kingdom government's strategy to degrade the Houthis. With that specific point, looking at all the levers that we have, militarily, economically, diplomatically, our key ally, the United States, has taken a specific decision where the United Kingdom has not taken yet. The United States has prescribed the Houthis as a terrorist organisation, with that coming into effect in 30 days' time. Why has the United Kingdom government not done that?
Well, my honourable friend will understand that on the issue of sanctioning and prescriptions, we would not give a running commentary to the House ahead of making any such announcement. So I'm not able to give him an answer to that. But I'll give away just a moment, but I just want to finish the comments, dealing with the comments by the Shadow Secretary of State. He also asked about HMS Diamond, and will she be replaced on station? And the answer is yes, she will be replaced by HMS Richmond, but he'll accept, I hope, that I cannot give any operational details about that. He also raised the issue of Israel-Gaza, and which is adjacent to this debate, if not directly part of it. And this was similarly raised by the honourable gentleman for Hammersmith, for Manchester Withington, whose son we thank for his service, my right honourable friend for North Somerset, the honourable lady for Oxford West and Abingdon, the honourable gentleman for East Lothian, and indeed the shadow spokesman who has just spoken on these matters. And colleagues throughout the debate who've raised this point, I want to reiterate that there is no link between our action of self-defence in the Red Sea and the situation in Israel, Gaza. The Houthis are using these events in Israel and Gaza as an excuse to destabilize the region further, while the Houthis are trying to paint themselves as protectors of the oppressed. Their own track record of oppression shows them in a very different light. Britain wants to see an end to the fighting in Gaza as soon as possible. We are calling for an immediate humanitarian pause, Madam Deputy Speaker, to get aid in and hostages out, and as a vital step towards building a sustainable, permanent ceasefire without a return to destruction, fighting and loss of life. And to achieve that, we need that Hamas agrees to release all the hostages. Hamas can no longer be in charge of Gaza, and an agreement must be in place for the Palestinian Authority to return to Gaza. And while I'm on this point, perhaps I could say, particularly to the honourable gentleman for East Lothian, just a word or two about the reference to the ICJ. The government believes that the referral by South Africa to the International Court of Justice is unhelpful, but of course we respect the role and independence of the ICJ. What I can say to the House, particularly on Holocaust Memorial Day today, is that the suggestion that Israel is engaged in genocide against the Palestinian people is both wrong and profoundly offensive. And may I make that clear on Holocaust Memorial Day, that we remember the genocide also in Rwanda in 1994, in Bosnia in 1995, in Sudan in 2003, as well as in Cambodia in the 1970s. And if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, update the House, the ICJ has announced during the course of this debate that they will deliver their decision on South Africa's request for provisional measures at 12 o'clock UK time on Friday the 26th. Now, if I may return to the excellent speeches made by so many of my honourable and right honourable friends and honourable members opposite, I will turn first to the speech by the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. But before I do that, I shall give way to my right honourable friend.
My right honourable friend, the Minister, is, as always, the model of courtesy. For the avoidance of any lingering doubt, and I'm sure this can be avoided because I'm getting very positive signals from the Defence Secretary sitting to his left, would he like to confirm that HMS Albion and HMS Bulwark, whose planned out-of-service dates are 2033 and 2034 respectively, not only will not be scrapped ahead of time, but will not be mothballed either?
He is absolutely right to detect the supportive view of the Secretary of State for Defence while he was speaking. Now, if I may now return to... I give way to my honourable friend.
As a former serviceman, I have a simple view that quantity has a quality all of its own.
He would say that.
So can the Minister please assure the House whether or not the FCDO has asked the MOD for additional platforms to be sent to the region with a view to both offering deterrence against aggressors and also ensuring safe passage of British shipping?
Well, my honourable friend will have heard the words of the Prime Minister explaining both what the strategy is and how we are implementing it. And I can tell him that the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence are perfectly joined in every sense in pursuing that strategy. So turning to my honourable friend for Rutland and Melton, who in these matters, of course, is something of a poacher turned gamekeeper, or maybe it's a gamekeeper turned poacher, because she was previously a distinguished member of the diplomatic corps. She spoke and delivered trenchant support for our actions. She spoke up for Arab-led initiatives in the region. And I thank her very much also for agreeing to organise a workshop on Iran in the House of Commons for half a day. Turning to the honourable gentleman for West Dunbartonshire, he asks who we are listening to, and the answer is we are listening to the House, and he will have heard today a House united. He set out the challenges facing the defence budget, and there are many people in the House who will understand and agree with him that the challenges are significant, but we are tackling those challenges. I will in a moment. My honourable friend for Elmet and Rothwell spoke warmly and rightly about the Royal Navy. We thank him for his support, and he gave us the House a geopolitical discourse, in particular on the challenges to the global food chain, and the whole House will have heard what he said. My honourable friend for North Wiltshire reminded us of the excellence of his book, and we authors must stick together. He also explained, as the Prime Minister did, why Parliament was not consulted in this set of circumstances, a point that was then also visited by two honourable gentlemen opposite, and to which I will come in a moment. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful for the Minister for giving way on a point of listening. There has been concern about a change of registration or vessels going through the Red Sea, notably those changing to the People's Republic of China. If he can't give me an answer today, maybe he might want to write to the Defence Committee, or indeed the Chair, who is sitting in their place, about how many vessels, merchant fleet, are changing from their country of origin to become registered within the People's Republic of China, and if Chinese vessels registered in the People's Republic have been targeted.
He asked me a detailed question, Madam Deputy Speaker, and both the Secretary of State for Transport and the Secretary of State for Defence will have heard what he has said, and I'm sure they will be happy to write to him. My honourable friend, the Right Honourable Member for North Somerset, spoke about the danger and the nature of the Iranian regime, and eloquently set out the threat to international maritime law. And as I said to our honourable friend, I cannot give a commentary on the issue of IRGC prescription, but I can tell him that we have heard the views of him and other right honourable and honourable members.
Will you give way a moment?
I will, yeah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy. I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, but he also will recall that I mentioned on several occasions now why were Iran Air still flying from Heathrow and why are Iranian banks still trading in the City of London. Separate issues, but nonetheless important alongside the prescription issue.
Well, I will ensure that my right honourable friend has a detailed answer on where we stand on both those two issues. The Honourable Lady for Oxford West and Abingdon spoke movingly and also compellingly, as I think the whole House agrees, about the importance of the two-state solution, not just being in the interests of Israelis and Palestinians, but of the wider region and of all of us here in the UK. And my honourable friend for Meon Valley gave powerful warnings about the dangers of starvation in Yemen, and also a point echoed by the honourable gentleman for Caerphilly. The honourable gentleman for Ross and Skye supported working more closely with the region and the importance of tackling wider examples of instability. And the whole House will have been grateful for his remarks, and in particular for the wise words he spoke about Ukraine. My honourable friend for the Isle of Wight talked about the impact and the effect of Iran proxies, and he spoke with both experience and knowledge about the risks of warfare and the need for a greater sense of strategy, in particular looking at the work of the National Security Council, which some of us were involved with when it was set up. And I have taken a careful note of what he said. The right honourable gentleman for Hayes and Harlington mentioned that he thought he was joining a debate with defence nerds, and I want to assure him of a warm welcome to our number. He, along with the honourable gentleman for Tiverton and Honiton, spoke about the importance of having a vote. And I think that the government has made clear that it's neither practical nor sensible to publicise an action like this in advance. It could both undermine the effectiveness of the action and potentially risk the lives of armed forces personnel involved. And in the interesting inner debate between him and my honourable friend. My view was that my honourable friend had the better of that debate. I'll give way, of course.
What about the situation of retrospective approval?
Well, I think that was the point. That was the point he raised, and which my honourable friend, I thought, answered with great eloquence. My honourable friend for South Dorset spoke using his detailed military knowledge to the advantage of the House with considerable historical analogy, and the honourable lady for Bath warned the House about the importance of defending international maritime law. Of course, I give way to...
Most great, honourable friend. I did ask whether why the aircraft carriers are not being used in the Red Sea, and I'd be grateful if some answer could be given.
Well, the issue of the use of the aircraft carriers, one of which is heading to a NATO exercise anyway, will be kept under review. And if the assets which they bring to bear on our central aims in this matter are appropriate, then of course the right decision will be taken. And finally, I think I've already answered the point from the honourable gentleman for Tiverton and Honiton, which my honourable friend for North Wiltshire engaged with specifically. So I think I've covered every speech that has been made, Madam Deputy Speaker, but if I may draw my remarks to a close, we have sent the clearest possible message that we will continue to reduce the Houthis' ability to carry out these attacks, and we will back our warning with actions. The Houthis should be under no misunderstanding that Britain and our allies are committed to holding them to account. Yesterday's statement from 24 countries condemned and demanded an end to the Red Sea attacks. Military strikes are just one part of our wider response. Firstly, we are increasing our diplomatic engagement. The Prime Minister spoke to President Biden about these issues on Monday night, and the Foreign Secretary, who is even now in the region and will be visiting a number of different countries. He has a meeting today with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he met his Iranian counterpart last week. And he made it clear that they must cease supplying the Houthis and use their influence to stop Houthi attacks. Secondly, we must end the illegal flow of arms to the Houthis. We've intercepted weapon shipments in the regions before, including components of the very missiles used by the Houthis today. And those who supply such weapons to the Houthis to conduct these attacks are violating UN Security Council Resolution 2216 and international law. And thirdly, we will use the most effective means at our disposal to cut off the Houthis' financial resources where they are used to fund these attacks. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to keep helping the people of Yemen, who have suffered so grievously as a result of the country's civil war, and who the Houthis' actions make worse. And we will continue to deliver humanitarian aid and support a negotiated peace in that conflict. That is the position, Madam Deputy Speaker, and ministers are absolutely committed to keeping the House fully informed as the House sees fit.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered the situation in the Red Sea. As mayors that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And so we come to motion number 6 on Church of England General Synod measures and motion number 7 on Church of England General Synod measures. Andrew Selous to move.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order papers, mayors that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Petition Azhar Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to present this petition urging the government to call on Israel and Hamas to implement an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and for the immediate release of all hostages. Over the last 4 months, Gaza has been subject to unrelenting bombardment, which, following almost 2 decades of siege, has created a humanitarian crisis. Almost 100,000 Palestinians killed and injured by the Israeli military, and millions more have been displaced and are subject to severe shortages of food, medicine, water, and aid with no end in sight. The petitioners therefore request that the House of Commons urges the government to call on Israel and Hamas to implement an immediate and sustained ceasefire to prevent further bloodshed and damage, so that a peaceful two-state solution may be achieved in Palestine and Israel, and the petitioners remain, etc.
Afsal Khan.
Thank you. Petition, ceasefire in Gaza.
Thank you.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn.